complex that even after thousands of years of excavation, scholarship, and discovery, we have barely scratched the surface of what it truly was. That land is Egypt, and the story it has to tell is unlike anything else in the long and turbulent history of human existence on this planet. For centuries, explorers, treasure hunters, scholars, and dreamers have been drawn to Egypt like moths to a flame. They came looking for gold, for glory, for knowledge, for proof of things they had only dared to imagine. Some found riches beyond their wildest expectations. Others found only questions, mysteries so deep and so layered that answering one seemed only to reveal three more lurking beneath it. And today, armed with technologies that those early explorers could never have conceived of, ground-penetrating radar, satellite imaging, three-dimensional scanning, chemical analysis, genetic sequencing, modern archaeologists are making discoveries that are forcing us to completely rethink everything we thought we knew about this ancient world. What you are about to hear is not a simple retelling of a well-worn story. This is not the Egypt of textbooks that have sat unchanged on classroom shelves for decades. This is a living, breathing Egypt, a civilization that is still revealing itself to us, still surprising us, still humbling us with the sheer scale and sophistication of what its people achieved. Over the course of this documentary, we are going to travel deep into the heart of that civilization. We are going to stand at the edge of the Nile, that great artery of life without which none of this would have been possible, and we are going to watch as it reveals its secrets one by one. We are going to descend beneath the Giza Plateau and peer into chambers that no human eye has seen in thousands of years. We are going to sit in the shadow of temples built by a woman who dared to do what no woman before her had done, who seized the most powerful throne in the ancient world and held it with grace, intelligence, and an iron will. We are going to cross the burning Sinai desert and find, to our astonishment, that it was not always the desolate wasteland it appears to be today. And we are going to follow the trail of a radical pharaoh whose ideas were so explosive, so fundamentally threatening to the established order, that his own successors tried to erase him from history entirely. This is the story of ancient Egypt as it has never quite been told before. This is a story being written right now, in real time, and women crouching in the desert with brushes and a burning hunger to know. So settle in, because within 2,000 years of mystery, majesty, and breathtaking human achievement. And it begins, as almost everything in Egypt begins, with the river. The Nile is not simply a river. To describe it that way would be like describing the sun as simply a star, technically accurate but so reductive as to be almost meaningless. The Nile is the reason Egypt exists. It is the reason that in the middle of one of the most unforgiving deserts on the face of the earth, a civilization of extraordinary sophistication and longevity was able to take root, to grow, to flourish for more than 3,000 years in a way that no other ancient civilization managed to replicate. Without the Nile, there is no Egypt. Without the Nile, there are no pyramids, no temples, no hieroglyphs, no mummies, no pharaohs. There is only sand and silence and the merciless sun beating down on a landscape empty of everything except its own brutal beauty. The ancient Egyptians understood this with a clarity that was almost religious, because for them it was religious. The Nile was not just a geographical feature. It was a divine gift, a manifestation of the gods' favor toward the Egyptian people and the Egyptian land. They called it Itru, simply the river, because there was no other river worth naming by comparison. Every year, with a predictability that felt like a miracle repeated endlessly, the Nile would flood its banks, spreading across the surrounding land and depositing a rich, dark layer of silt that made the soil extraordinarily fertile. This flooding was so central to Egyptian life that they named it after the god Hapi, a deity depicted as a blue or green figure with the body of a heavy-set man, symbolizing abundance and the bringing of life. The flooding season was called Akhit, and when the waters receded, they left behind a black, nourishing earth that the Egyptians called Kemet, the Black Land, which was also one of the names they used for their own country. Everything beyond the reach of the flood, the endless yellow and red desert, was Deseret, the Red Land, the place of death and demons. This simple geographical division between the Black Land and the Red Land shaped everything about how ancient Egyptians saw the world. Life and civilization existed in the narrow green strip along the Nile's banks. Death and chaos existed everywhere else. And at the very center of this geography, moving ceaselessly from the heart of Africa northward to the great delta where it emptied into the Mediterranean Sea, The river carried not just water and silt and life, but something else. It carried people, it carried goods, it carried ideas. It carried the pharaoh himself, traveling in a manner befitting someone who was considered not just a ruler but a living god on earth. And this is where one of our most fascinating recent discoveries begins, because archaeologists working along the Nile have been uncovering evidence that the royal use of the river was far more elaborate, far more theatrical, and far more politically sophisticated than anyone previously imagined. Recent excavations and artifact analyses have revealed evidence of royal vessels of remarkable luxury, ships that were not merely functional transport but floating palaces, elaborate statements of power and divine status designed to awe everyone who saw them as they glided downstream on the gleaming waters of the Nile. Imagine standing on the bank of the Nile 4,000 years ago, perhaps as a farmer tending to your fields or a merchant unloading goods at a small riverside settlement. The air smells of mud and green things growing, the smell that meant survival, that meant another year of abundance rather than hunger. The sun is already climbing, beginning its daily journey across a sky so intensely blue it seems almost artificial. And then you see it coming, moving against the current with the steady rhythm of dozens of oars, or perhaps drifting with the current aided by a great sail billowing in the desert wind. A ship, but not just any ship. A vessel that seems to belong to another world entirely, its hull gleaming with polished cedar wood imported at enormous expense from the forests of what is now Lebanon, its prow and stern curving upward in graceful arcs decorated with gilded wood and painted imagery of the gods. On the deck, sheltered beneath canopies of the finest linen that diffused the brutal Egyptian sunlight into something soft and golden, figures moved in the manner of those who understood perfectly that they were always being watched, always performing their divine role for the benefit of the watching world. The pharaoh's river journeys were not simply travel from one place to another. They were processional events, carefully choreographed displays of power that reminded everyone who saw them that Egypt's ruler was not merely human. The royal fleet would include not just the pharaoh's own vessel, but a flotilla of accompanying ships carrying officials, priests, soldiers, servants, provisions, and the endless apparatus of royal administration. When the fleet arrived at a settlement, the arrival itself was a kind of ceremony, a moment charged with religious significance and political meaning. The pharaoh, stepping from the divine space of the royal ship onto the earthly ground of an Egyptian settlement, was enacting in physical terms the fundamental concept of Egyptian kingship, the idea that the divine order of the universe, what the Egyptians called Ma'at, righteousness and cosmic balance, was made manifest in the person and presence of the pharaoh. Recent archaeological work has added remarkable new detail to our understanding of these royal vessels. Analysis of wood fragments, paintings, and inscriptions from various sites has revealed that the largest royal ships were extraordinary achievements of ancient engineering. They were built from cedar logs imported from Lebanon, wood so valuable and so difficult to obtain that it was essentially a luxury material, available only to the very wealthiest and most powerful individuals in the ancient world. The cedar forests of Lebanon were ancient Egypt's equivalent of an exotic foreign resource, something that had to be sought at great distance and considerable expense, and the fact that Egyptian pharaohs used this wood for their river vessels says everything about the scale of their ambition and the reach of their power. These ships were not small. The largest royal vessels could reach lengths of more than 40 meters, which is comparable to a small modern ship, and they were elaborately decorated both inside and out. The cabins on the royal deck, where the pharaoh and members of the royal family would have spent their time during journeys, were fitted with the finest furniture that Egyptian craftsmen could produce, chairs and couches of gilded wood inlaid with ebony and ivory, linen hangings dyed in rich colors, alabaster vessels for food and drink, and all the other equipment of royal luxury. Outside, the hull and superstructure of the ship would have been painted with religious imagery and scenes celebrating the pharaoh's divine status, turning the vessel itself into a kind of floating temple, a statement in wood and paint and gold that the gods were present and that Egypt was favored above all other lands. But the royal ships were not merely symbols. They were also tools, and among the most important things they transported was the pharaoh's ability to govern. In a civilization strung out along the length of a single great river, physical presence was enormously important. A pharaoh who could travel quickly and comfortably along the Nile could visit temples, oversee building projects, receive tribute from local governors, adjudicate disputes, and perform the religious ceremonies that were considered essential for maintaining cosmic order. The river, in other words, was the spine of Egyptian civilization, and the royal fleet was how power traveled along that spine. It was in this context of the Nile as a highway of power and commerce that one of the most extraordinary recent archaeological discoveries must be understood. Not far from the site of ancient Memphis, the great capital that stood near the apex of the Nile's delta and served for much of Egyptian history as the political and administrative heart of the country, archaeologists have excavated what they are describing as a valley temple unlike anything previously known. The structure dates to approximately 4,500 years ago, placing it in the Old Kingdom period, the era of pyramid building of pharaohs like Khufu and Khafre and Menkaure, the age when Egypt's civilization was finding its full stride, and its builders were undertaking projects of such ambition that they still astonish us today. The Valley Temple concept was not itself new to archaeologists. Valley temples were known structures, typically built at the lower, riverside end of a causeway that led up to a pyramid complex. They served as the entry point into the sacred precinct of the royal mortuary cult, the place where the pharaoh's body would have arrived by boat from the royal palace to begin its journey toward its final resting place in the pyramid. The Valley Temple associated with the Pyramid of Khafre at Giza is one of the best-known examples, a magnificent structure of polished red granite that has survived remarkably well and gives us a sense of the grandeur these buildings once possessed. But this newly excavated Valley Temple is different in ways that are genuinely exciting to archaeologists and historians. For one thing, it is much larger than previously known examples, suggesting a scale of ritual activity and official function that was more elaborate than had been assumed for this period. For another, it shows clear evidence of having served not just as a religious building, but as a genuine hub of commercial and administrative activity, a place where the sacred and the secular, the divine and the practical, were thoroughly intermixed in a way that tells us something very important about how ancient Egyptian society actually functioned. The excavation team working at this site has uncovered a remarkable array of artifacts and architectural features. There are storerooms that would have held provisions and luxury goods, spaces that speak not just of religious ceremony, but of serious logistical organization. There are administrative areas with evidence of record-keeping, the Egyptian bureaucracy at work even at the doorstep of a sacred precinct. And then there is something that has particularly captured the imagination of researchers, evidence of what appears to be an ancient public calendar, carved or inscribed in a place where it could be read by people approaching the temple from the riverside. The significance of this calendar cannot be overstated. In a civilization as dependent on time and its proper measurement as ancient Egypt, the ability to track and announce the passage of days, months, and the all-important annual cycle of the Nile's flooding was a form of power. The Egyptian calendar was one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world. It divided the year into 3 seasons reflecting the Nile's behavior: the flood season, the growing season, and the harvest season, and further divided each season into months, and those months into weeks and days. At the same time, Egyptian priests tracked a separate lunar calendar used for religious festivals, and they were aware of a stellar calendar based on the rising and setting of particularly important stars, most notably Sirius, whose annual reappearance on the eastern horizon at dawn was seen as the harbinger of the Nile flood and was used to anchor the Egyptian year. A public calendar carved on or near a valley temple would have served multiple purposes simultaneously. It would have announced upcoming religious festivals and ceremonies, telling the surrounding population when important events would take place. It would have communicated the rhythm of the agricultural year, telling farmers when they should expect the flood to arrive, when they should begin planting, when harvest time was approaching. And it would have reinforced the central ideology of Egyptian kingship, because in Egyptian thinking, it was the pharaoh who maintained cosmic order, and the regular, predictable cycle of the seasons was a manifestation of that order. By displaying the calendar prominently on a royal temple, the king was essentially reminding everyone who saw it that this orderly progression of time was happening because the pharaoh was doing his divine job properly. The discovery of this valley temple is also exciting for what it reveals about the relationship between the great royal building projects of the Old Kingdom and the wider world of trade and commerce that made them possible. We sometimes think of the pyramids and the temples as existing in a kind of pure realm of divine kingship, separate from the messy economic realities of the ancient world, but of course they were not. Building a pyramid required enormous quantities of raw materials, stone and copper and wood and rope and 100 other things, and those materials had to be sourced, transported, and managed through systems of procurement and distribution that were, in their way, as impressive as the construction they supported. A valley temple that served as a commercial hub as well as a religious one gives us a glimpse into these systems, showing us that the sacred and the economic were not separate domains in ancient Egypt but thoroughly interwoven aspects of a single, remarkably complex civilization. The goods that flowed through a hub like this valley temple would have included both domestic products, grain, beer, linen, pottery, cattle, fish, and imported luxury items that were essential to the royal court and the temple system. Cedar from Lebanon has already been mentioned, but the list of Egyptian imports was remarkably long and came from remarkably distant places. From Nubia to the south came gold, which Egypt possessed in quantities that made it the envy of the ancient world, as well as ebony, leopard skins, and cattle. From Punt, a land that archaeologists still debate the exact location of, but which seems to have been somewhere in the region of modern Eritrea or Somalia, came myrrh and frankincense, the aromatic resins without which Egyptian religious ritual would have been impossible, as well as living trees, electrum, which is a natural alloy of gold and silver and other exotic goods. From the eastern Mediterranean came copper and tin, the raw materials for bronze, which was the essential metal of the age. From the north came olive oil and wine in great ceramic jars. All of this trade moved primarily by water. The Nile carried goods up and down the length of Egypt. Coastal and offshore trade routes connected Egypt to Lebanon, Cyprus, and the wider Mediterranean world. And the Red Sea, reached by crossing the eastern desert or the Sinai Peninsula, provided access to the trade routes that led to Punt and beyond. Egypt was not an isolated civilization, cut off from the rest of the world by its deserts. It was a trading civilization, deeply embedded in ancient networks of exchange that spanned thousands of miles and connected cultures that might seem, on the surface, to have had very little in common. From the banks of the Nile and the revelations of the newly excavated Valley Temple, we move now to what is perhaps the single most iconic archaeological site in the world, a complex of structures so familiar that their silhouettes have become symbols not just of Egypt but of human achievement itself. The Giza Plateau, rising above the west bank of the Nile just south of the modern city of Cairo, is home to three great pyramids, a collection of smaller subsidiary pyramids and mastaba tombs, the Great Sphinx, and several valley temples and causeways. It has been a destination for the curious and the reverent for more than 4,000 years. Ancient Egyptian pilgrims came here. Greek tourists came here. Roman emperors came here. And for the past 2 centuries, archaeologists from across the world have been coming here, digging and scanning and analyzing and arguing about what it all means and how it all came to be. And yet, despite all of that attention, despite thousands of years of visitors and 2 centuries of systematic archaeological work, the Giza Plateau is still, astonishingly, giving up new secrets. Recent advances in scanning technology have revealed something that has sent a charge of excitement through the archaeological world and rekindled debates about what exactly lies beneath the surface of this ancient and endlessly mysterious place. The Great Pyramid of Giza, known to the ancient Egyptians as Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu, is the oldest and largest of the 3 main pyramids on the plateau. It was built for the pharaoh Khufu, who reigned during the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, roughly around 2560 BCE, give or take a few decades. When it was completed, it was the tallest man-made structure on Earth, and it would hold that record for more than 3,800 years, until the construction of medieval cathedrals in Europe finally surpassed it. Even today, after millennia of erosion and stone robbing that have removed the original smooth white limestone casing, and reduced its height slightly from the original 146 meters to the current 138 meters, it is an overwhelming physical presence. Standing at its base and looking up at the mountain of stone above you, the sheer scale of human ambition it represents is difficult to process. The Great Pyramid consists of approximately 2.3 million blocks of stone, ranging in weight from a couple of tons to more than 80 tons for the heaviest blocks in the burial chamber. The total mass of stone is estimated at more than 6 million tons. The precision with which it was constructed is remarkable, with the four sides of the base differing from perfect equality by less than 0.5%, and the structure oriented to true north with an accuracy that modern surveyors find almost incomprehensible given the tools available to ancient builders. It contains, as far as we knew until very recently, 3 main chambers connected by a system of passages. The lowest chamber is cut into the bedrock beneath the pyramid and was apparently left unfinished. Above it is the so-called Queen's Chamber, which was probably not intended for a queen at all but served some ritual function that is still not entirely clear. And at the heart of the pyramid, reached by the soaring Grand Gallery, is the King's Chamber, a room of polished red granite that once held the pharaoh's sarcophagus. But here is where things get genuinely extraordinary. In recent years, a team of scientists using a technique called muon tomography, which works somewhat like an X-ray, but uses naturally occurring subatomic particles called muons rather than X-rays, and which can penetrate even massive stone structures to reveal variations in density, discovered a large void inside the Great Pyramid that had never previously been identified. This void is significant in its dimensions, running above the Grand Gallery and extending for at least 30 meters. It appears to be a genuine unknown chamber or corridor, a space that has apparently been sealed and unvisited since the pyramid was completed more than 4,000 years ago. The announcement of this discovery, made public through a paper published in the prestigious journal Nature, caused a sensation in both the scientific community and the broader public. What is in this chamber? What was it for? Was it purely a construction feature, a deliberate void left to reduce the weight of stone pressing down on the Grand Gallery below? Or does it represent something more significant, a previously unknown room with contents or inscriptions or features that could transform our understanding of the pyramid and its builders? As of now, those questions remain unanswered, because accessing the void without damaging the pyramid is an enormous technical challenge. The pyramid is both an incredibly fragile artifact, irreplaceable and irreparably harmed by any careless intervention, and a massively thick and solid structure that is not easy to penetrate. Archaeologists and engineers are working on developing techniques, possibly using robots or minimally invasive endoscopic cameras, that might allow them to look inside the void without causing damage. The possibility of what they might find there is almost too exciting to contemplate. But the void inside the pyramid is only part of the story, because it is not just inside the pyramids that new discoveries are being made. It is also beneath the Giza plateau itself, in the bedrock and the deep earth that the pyramids sit upon, that researchers are finding evidence of structures and spaces that nobody knew existed. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the plateau have revealed what appear to be extensive tunnel systems and chambers carved into the bedrock at various depths below the surface. Some of these are likely known features of the site, parts of the elaborate drainage systems and service tunnels that were associated with the ancient monuments, but others are less easily explained. There are anomalies in the radar data that suggest large underground spaces, significantly larger than any known structure on the site, in locations where no such structures have been previously documented. This has led to some genuinely fascinating speculation about the possibility of what might be called a lost city beneath Giza, a complex of underground structures that predate the pyramids themselves or were built as part of the same enormous construction project but have never been found or examined. The ancient Egyptians had a tradition, documented in later religious texts, of believing that beneath Giza lay a place they called the Rostau, a kind of gateway to the underworld, a mysterious realm that existed at the boundary between the land of the living and the land of the dead. Whether this tradition was purely mythological or whether it reflected some memory of actual underground structures is a question that has fascinated Egyptologists and alternative historians alike for decades. What we can say with confidence is that the Giza Plateau holds more secrets than we have yet discovered, and that the technology now available to archaeologists is beginning to reveal the outlines of those secrets even before we have the means to fully investigate them. It is a tantalizing situation, like being able to see through a frosted glass window and make out the shapes on the other side without being able to clearly distinguish what they are. The shapes are there, they are real. And eventually we will see them clearly. It is worth pausing here to think about the sheer scale of the achievement represented by the pyramids of Giza, not just the Great Pyramid but all three of them, because even if we focus exclusively on what is known and documented, leaving aside the tantalizing mysteries of unknown chambers and underground tunnels, what was accomplished here in the span of a few generations is staggering. The three main pyramids, Khufu's Great Pyramid, Khafre's slightly smaller pyramid which appears larger because it sits on higher ground, and Menkaura's significantly smaller pyramid, represent a concentration of human effort and organizational ability that is almost without parallel in the ancient world. Consider what was required to build just the Great Pyramid. The stone, most of it limestone, quarried locally on the plateau itself, but with the finest casing stones coming from the Tura quarries across the Nile, and the granite for the internal chambers from Aswan, more than 800 kilometers to the south, had to be quarried, shaped, transported, and precisely placed, all without the use of wheels for most of this work, without iron tools, without any of the mechanical advantages that modern construction takes for granted. The workforce required to accomplish this was enormous, not the enslaved population of Hollywood movies, as the archaeological evidence makes abundantly clear, but a highly organized workforce of skilled craftsmen, laborers, administrators, physicians, bakers, brewers, and all the other specialists needed to support a major construction project. Archaeological work at a site called Hayt el-Ghurab, discovered on the Giza Plateau in the 1990s and extensively excavated in the years since, has revealed the remains of the workers' settlement associated with the pyramid construction. And what it shows is not a camp of miserable enslaved people, but a community of surprisingly well-fed, well-housed, and organizationally sophisticated workers. The bakeries discovered at the site were capable of producing prodigious quantities of bread. The breweries could produce enormous amounts of beer, which was a dietary staple in ancient Egypt rather than merely an intoxicant. The medical remains suggest that workers who were injured received medical care, including sophisticated surgeries, and the administrative records, written in ink on pottery fragments and papyrus, reveal a bureaucracy of impressive complexity organizing the labor, supplies, and logistics of the construction. One of the most remarkable documents ever found in Egypt is a papyrus discovered at a site called Wadi al-Jarf, on the coast of the Red Sea, in 2013. This papyrus, which dates to the reign of Khufu and is therefore the oldest papyrus ever found in Egypt, is the diary of a man named Merer, an official who was responsible for managing a team of workers and boats that transported limestone from the Tura quarries to the Giza Plateau. Merer's diary is an extraordinary document, a first-hand account, written in real time by someone who was actually involved in building the Great Pyramid, of the logistics and organization of that enormous project. It describes the movement of boats loaded with stone blocks, the management of workers and supplies, the involvement of high officials up to and including the pharaoh's half-brother Ankif, who seems to have been the director of construction. It is mundane in many ways, a day-to-day work record rather than an epic narrative, but that very mundanity makes it invaluable. It shows us that the pyramid was built not by magic or by supernatural means, as some have fantastically claimed, but by ordinary human beings working within an extraordinarily well-organized system, doing their jobs, recording their progress, and collectively creating something that has outlasted every other human construction by millennia. The pyramid builders were not slaves, they were not aliens, they were Egyptians, and the pyramid was their monument as much as it was their pharaohs. The graffiti left by work gangs inside the pyramid, including playful names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaura, gives us a glimpse of the human beings behind the colossal achievement, people with a sense of humor and an evident pride in their work. This is one of the things that makes recent archaeological discoveries at Giza so deeply moving. Every new detail we uncover about how the pyramids were built and who built them makes these ancient people more real to us, more present, more recognizable as fellow humans separated from us by time but not by nature. And yet the mysteries remain, the unknown void inside the Great Pyramid, the anomalous signals in the ground penetrating radar surveys. The persistent question of what exactly the Sphinx is guarding, because the Sphinx, that enormous figure with a human head and a lion's body carved from a single outcrop of limestone on the Giza Plateau, has its own deep mysteries that have resisted solution for centuries. Who does the Sphinx's face represent? The most widely accepted scholarly view is that it depicts Khafre, since it faces his pyramid and is believed to have been carved during his reign. But there are dissenting opinions, and the Sphinx keeps its own counsel on the matter, staring eastward with a serene, slightly damaged expression that has outlasted kingdoms. One of the most persistent mysteries associated with the Sphinx is the question of whether there are hidden chambers beneath it. Ancient texts, including an inscription on a stele that was found between the Sphinx's paws and dates to the reign of Thutmose IV centuries after the Sphinx was carved, describe what seems to be a chamber hidden in the body of the Sphinx. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in recent decades have indeed revealed cavities in the bedrock around and possibly beneath the Sphinx, but the Egyptian authorities, understandably cautious about any intervention that might damage one of their most precious monuments, have not authorized the kind of excavation that would confirm or refute the existence of hidden chambers. So the Sphinx sits, as it has sat for 4,500 years, keeping its secrets. Around it, the desert wind moves the sand in slow, shifting patterns. The pyramids stand against the sky, and beneath the plateau, in chambers and tunnels that no one has entered in millennia, the ancient world waits. If the pyramids of Giza represent ancient Egypt at the height of its architectural and organizational power, at the apex of a tradition of royal monument building that defines our mental image of the civilization, then the story of Hatshepsut represents ancient Egypt at its most humanly compelling, at its most dramatically unexpected, and perhaps at its most genuinely inspiring. Because the story of Hatshepsut is, at its core, the story of a woman who looked at a world defined by male power and divine sanction for male rule, and decided, with breathtaking audacity, that the rules did not apply to her. Hatshepsut, whose name means something like foremost of noble women, was the daughter of one of Egypt's most successful pharaohs, Thutmose I, who had expanded Egyptian power into Nubia and the Levant, and whose reign was marked by military success and domestic prosperity. She was also, as her father's daughter and later as a royal wife, a woman of immense privilege. But privilege in the ancient world had its limits, and for women in ancient Egypt, even royal women, the highest limits were very clear. You could be a queen, you could be a king's mother. You could wield enormous informal power, influence, and wealth, but you could not be pharaoh. The role of pharaoh was male by definition, a man who embodied the god Horus in life and became Osiris in death. It was a role so thoroughly gendered that even the Egyptian language expressed it exclusively in masculine terms. Hatshepsut changed that. Exactly how she changed it, and what combination of political skill, personal ambition, favorable circumstances, and sheer nerve was required to make that change happen, is something that archaeologists and historians have been debating ever since her story was pieced together from the monuments and inscriptions that survived the deliberate attempts of later pharaohs to erase her from history. What we know for certain is that she became one of the most successful rulers of the New Kingdom, one of the most prolific builders in Egyptian history, and one of the most extraordinary individuals in the entire ancient world. Her path to power began with the circumstances of her husband's reign. Hatshepsut married her half-brother Thutmose II, who became pharaoh after their father's death. This kind of marriage within the royal family was common in ancient Egypt, where keeping power within the bloodline of the royal family was considered essential for maintaining divine legitimacy. Thutmose II and Hatshepsut had a daughter together, Neferir, but no son. When Thutmose II died, still a relatively young man, the heir to the throne was a boy named Thutmose III, the son of a secondary wife. This boy was Hatshepsut's stepson and eventually the person whose own successors would try to obliterate her from the historical record. But when Thutmose III was too young to rule in his own right, Hatshepsut became his regent, the adult royal figure who exercised power in the young king's name. This was not unprecedented. Women in positions of regency had existed in Egyptian history before. What happened next, however, was unprecedented. Sometime around 7 years into her regency, Hatshepsut stopped being regent and declared herself pharaoh. Full pharaoh, not queen, not regent, but the king himself, complete with all 5 of the royal titulary names that identified the pharaoh's divine status and cosmic role. And here's where things get truly fascinating from an archaeological perspective, because Hatshepsut knew with perfect clarity that the ideology of Egyptian kingship was deeply gendered. The pharaoh was Horus. the pharaoh was male. The religious and political architecture of Egyptian civilization was built on this assumption. So Hatshepsut made a choice that was as politically brilliant as it was personally audacious. She did not try to change the ideology. She adapted herself to it, or rather she adapted her public image to it. In official representations, statues, relief carvings, inscriptions, Hatshepsut was depicted as male. She wore the pharaoh's false beard, the traditional ceremonial beard worn by male pharaohs as a symbol of their divine kingship. She wore the double crown and the Neem's headcloth and the kilt of a male pharaoh. In inscriptions, the pronouns used to describe her shifted between masculine and feminine depending on context in ways that suggest the scribes were navigating genuinely new ideological territory, working out how to accommodate this unprecedented reality within the existing framework of royal ideology. But Hatshepsut also, in more private contexts and in some of her most personal monuments, acknowledged her female identity. Some of her statues show her in female dress even while wearing male royal insignia, a deliberate choice that seems to assert both her female identity and her royal authority simultaneously. The linguistic slippage between masculine and feminine in texts about her suggests not confusion but a kind of careful navigation, an attempt to hold two apparently contradictory truths in the same frame, that she was a woman and that she was pharaoh. For Egyptologists, this makes Hatshepsut's reign one of the most intellectually rich periods in Egyptian history to study. Every artifact associated with her is charged with meaning. Every choice she made about how to represent herself was a statement about identity, power, and legitimacy that was simultaneously personal and political, individual and ideological. And she made a great many such choices because Hatshepsut was one of the most prolific builders in Egyptian history, a monarch who left her mark on the landscape of Egypt in ways that her successors found very difficult to erase despite their best efforts. Her building program was extraordinary in its ambition and its geographic range. She built at Karnak, the great temple complex at Thebes that was the religious heart of Egypt during the New Kingdom, adding obelisks and pylons and a magnificent festival hall. She built at Luxor and at Medinet Habu and at several other sites across Egypt. She sent trading expeditions to Punt that returned with incense trees, ebony, ivory, gold, and live animals. She organized mining expeditions to Sinai and quarrying expeditions to Aswan. She erected obelisks of a size that would have been remarkable achievements for any ruler, 4 of them at Karnak alone, 2 of which still stand today, their gilded tips once catching the Egyptian sun and visible for miles across the flat, brilliantly lit landscape. But her greatest achievement, the monument for which she is most often remembered and which stands today as one of the finest buildings not just in Egypt but in the entire ancient world, is the temple at Deir el-Bahari, on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, in the shadow of the great rocky cliff that separates the Valley of the Nile from the Valley of the Kings. This temple, which the ancient Egyptians called Djeser Djeseru, meaning the Holy of Holies, is a building of such architectural perfection, such elegant simplicity of design, and such masterful integration with its natural setting that it takes the breath away even in its partially ruined modern state. The temple rises in 3 great terraces cut into the face of the cliff, connected by ramps that in antiquity would have been lined with sphinxes bearing Hatshepsut's face. Each terrace is fronted by a colonnade of square pillars, their surfaces covered with reliefs painted in vivid colors that would have made the whole structure glow against the buff-colored limestone cliff behind it. The reliefs depict scenes that were central to Hatshepsut's self-presentation as a legitimate pharaoh. There are scenes of the divine birth, showing how Hatshepsut was conceived when the god Amun, disguised as Thutmose I, visited her mother, making Hatshepsut literally the daughter of a god and therefore divinely entitled to the throne. There are scenes of the trading expedition to Punt, rendered in extraordinary detail that gives us a unique window into this exotic land and the nature of Egypt's commercial relationship with it. The people of Punt are shown with their distinctive physical features and their distinctive houses, built on stilts over water, and the goods being loaded onto Egyptian ships are rendered with such care that we can identify specific animals, specific plants, specific luxury items. And there are scenes of Hatshepsut herself, always in the royal regalia of a male pharaoh, performing the rituals of kingship, making offerings to the gods, leading ceremonies. Whatever private woman existed behind these images, whatever doubts or fears or personal motivations drove Hatshepsut's remarkable choices, the public face she presents in the reliefs of Deir el-Bahari is one of serene authority, of a ruler so comfortable in her divine role that the gender contradiction at the heart of her kingship seems almost invisible. The temple at Deir el-Bahari was not the work of a single creative genius, of course. Hatshepsut had a chief architect, a man named Senenmut, who is one of the most interesting supporting characters in this already fascinating story. Senenmut rose from relatively humble origins to become the most powerful official in Egypt during Hatshepsut's reign, managing her building projects, tutoring her daughter Neferir, and apparently enjoying a level of access to the queen pharaoh that was remarkable even for a high official. Ancient graffiti from the area around Deir el-Bahari, drawn by workers or visitors, includes crude images that seem to depict Hatshepsut and Senenmut in a sexual relationship, suggesting that the ancient Egyptians were gossiping about exactly the same thing that modern historians find fascinating. Whether or not the relationship was sexual in reality, Senenmut was clearly someone of enormous importance in Hatshepsut's regime, and his own tomb and other monuments survive to give us a picture of an exceptionally talented and ambitious man who rose further on the strength of his abilities and his royal patron's favor than almost anyone else in Egyptian history. The ceiling of his tomb is decorated with one of the most accurate astronomical charts from the ancient world, a testament to his intellectual abilities and the breadth of his interests. What happened to both Hatshepsut and Senenmut at the end of Hatshepsut's reign is unclear. Hatshepsut disappears from the historical record around the same time that Thutmose III begins to appear as sole pharaoh, which suggests that she died or was displaced around that point, but we do not know the circumstances. Senenmut also disappears from the record around the same time, and his tomb was never completed or used. Some historians have speculated that there was a coup of some kind, that the grown Thutmose III finally asserted his own claim to the throne and removed Hatshepsut, possibly forcibly. Others suggest she simply died of natural causes and Thutmose III, finally reaching adulthood, took the throne that was rightfully his. The evidence is ambiguous, and the mystery of what happened in those final days of Hatshepsut's reign is likely to remain unresolved. What is not ambiguous is what happened next. At some point after Hatshepsut's death, almost certainly during the reign of Thutmose III, a systematic effort was made to remove Hatshepsut from the historical record. Her images were chiseled from temple walls. Her name was erased from inscriptions and replaced with the names of her father, her husband, or Thutmose III himself. Her statues were smashed and buried in pits near her temple. The obelisks she had erected at Karnak were not destroyed, apparently because they were too large to demolish, but they were encased within a surrounding wall that hid them from view. It was as if someone had decided that Hatshepsut had never existed, that the decades of her reign had simply not happened. For centuries, this erasure was largely successful. When 19th-century Egyptologists began systematically studying the monuments of ancient Egypt, they could see that something had been erased from many of these texts and images, but they could not immediately determine what. For a long time, the mutilated images were attributed to a different pharaoh entirely, a man named Thutmose II, or a male pharaoh of otherwise unknown identity. It was not until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that the patient work of scholars, most notably the American Egyptologist Herbert Winlock working at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, began to piece together the truth, connecting the thousands of smashed statue fragments buried near Deir el-Bahari, and reading the damaged texts with fresh eyes informed by growing knowledge of Egyptian language and history. The result was one of the great detective stories in the history of archaeology. As the pieces were literally and figuratively assembled, a woman emerged from the debris, a woman of extraordinary power and vision who had been systematically hidden but could not ultimately be suppressed. Today, Hatshepsut is one of the most recognizable figures from the ancient world, the subject of books and documentaries and museum exhibitions, her temple one of the most visited monuments in Egypt. The woman who was erased from history has come back from the dead, more vivid and more real than ever, and the attempt to hide her has ultimately only made her story more compelling. But who ordered the erasure and why? The easy answer is Thutmose III, motivated by anger at a stepmother who had co-opted his throne during his youth. But some Egyptologists challenge this narrative. They point out that the erasure of Hatshepsut's images appears to have happened relatively late in Thutmose III's reign, not immediately after he took sole power. If he had been motivated primarily by personal animosity, why wait? Some scholars suggest that the erasure was more about practical political concerns, that as Thutmose III's own reign progressed and he began to think about succession, the anomaly of a female pharaoh in the recent past became a problem, a precedent that might be used to legitimize future claims by women to the throne, disrupting the orderly male succession that Thutmose III wanted to establish. By erasing Hatshepsut, he was not just settling a personal score but performing a kind of prophylactic erasure, eliminating a dangerous precedent. Whether or not this interpretation is correct, the story of Hatshepsut's erasure and rediscovery speaks to something profound about the way history works. History is not simply a neutral record of what happened. It is always shaped by power, by who controlled the ability to write and build and inscribe, by who had the motivation to preserve and who had the motivation to destroy. Ancient Egypt is full of deliberate erasures, places where later rulers chiseled out their predecessors' names and wrote their own, where the official record was adjusted to suit political convenience. Understanding these erasures, reading them as historical acts with their own motivations and consequences, is one of the most sophisticated things that modern Egyptology does. And in Hatshepsut's case, the erasure itself has become part of her story, adding a layer of drama and poignancy to an already remarkable life. From the temples and statues of Hatshepsut, we move now to a landscape that could hardly be more different in its physical character, but that is revealing archaeological discoveries of equally remarkable significance. The Sinai Peninsula is in many ways the threshold of Egypt, the land bridge that connects the African continent to Asia, the crossing point merchants and pilgrims and refugees have used for thousands of years. It is a place of stark, brutal beauty, a triangular wedge of desert and mountains where the air is dry and thin, and the sun beats down with a ferocity that makes even the Egyptian Nile Valley seem mild by comparison. The Sinai is not a place that invites extended habitation. It is, or at least it appears to be, a land for passing through rather than staying in, except that the ancient Egyptians did not simply pass through the Sinai. They colonized it, they built in it. They transformed parts of it in ways that modern archaeologists are only now beginning to fully appreciate. And a series of recent discoveries in the Sinai has revealed that this apparently inhospitable desert was, in certain places and at certain times, a landscape of surprising complexity and even, by the standards of the ancient world, comfort. The discovery that has perhaps captured the most attention is the excavation of a site that researchers are describing as a major ancient Egyptian installation in the Sinai, a site that appears to have included not just a fortress, the kind of military installation that we would expect to find in a border region, but something far more extensive and far more sophisticated. What has been found suggests the existence of a substantial settlement with the infrastructure of a real community rather than just a military outpost. The fortress itself, when its full dimensions became clear through excavation, proved to be enormous. Its walls enclosed an area large enough to contain not just soldiers and their equipment but storage facilities for large quantities of supplies, workshops for various crafts, administrative buildings, and what appeared to be religious structures. This was not a simple garrison. It was a functioning community, a place where people lived and worked and worshipped over what appears to have been an extended period of time. And then there was the discovery that stopped the excavation team in its tracks and made them reconsider everything they thought they knew about this site. Running away from the fortress and extending for a considerable distance along what would have been the main road through this part of the Sinai was a boulevard, a formal, planned avenue of trees. The evidence for this tree-lined road came from the careful analysis of soil samples and organic remains, which revealed the root systems and decayed organic material of a large number of trees that had been deliberately planted in a formal arrangement on either side of a roadway. In the middle of one of the harshest deserts in the world, the ancient Egyptians had created a shaded, green avenue. This discovery is significant on multiple levels. At the most practical level, a tree-lined road in the Sinai would have made travel along the main route into and out of Egypt significantly more bearable. The Sinai crossing was a journey that, depending on the route and the season, could take many days. Shade and the possibility of finding water near tree roots, even in a desert environment, would have been enormously valuable to travelers, whether soldiers, merchants, messengers, or the various other categories of people who had reason to make this crossing. A shaded road was a practical infrastructure investment, but it was also a statement of something more. The ability to plant and maintain trees in a desert environment required resources, specifically water. Getting sufficient water to keep trees alive in the Sinai, where rainfall is sparse and irregular, would have required either access to underground water sources or the artificial transport of water. Either way, it represented a significant ongoing commitment of resources and organizational effort. Maintaining a tree-lined road in the desert was not cheap or easy. Doing it demonstrated that whoever was responsible, the Egyptian state, in the person of the pharaoh and the administrative apparatus that served him, was powerful enough and organized enough and wealthy enough to undertake and sustain this kind of investment. And that, of course, is exactly the kind of statement that Egyptian pharaohs loved to make. The ability to transform hostile environments into productive, habitable, even beautiful spaces was a demonstration of royal power and divine favor. Just as the pharaoh maintained cosmic order in the religious and political realms, the pharaoh could also assert a kind of environmental mastery, imposing order and fertility on the chaotic, wild desert. Planting trees in the Sinai was, in this sense, a political as much as a practical act. The discovery of the tree-lined boulevard adds to a growing body of evidence that ancient Egyptian activity in the Sinai was far more extensive and far more sophisticated than had previously been appreciated. The Sinai was not just a corridor that Egyptians passed through on their way to somewhere else. It was a zone of active engagement, a landscape that Egypt's rulers were determined to mark with the visible signs of their presence and their power. In addition to the fortress and the boulevard, the Sinai contains evidence of Egyptian mining operations, particularly for the turquoise and copper that were found in the peninsula's mountains and were enormously valuable to the Egyptian economy. The Serabit el-Qadim site in the southern Sinai was the location of a major Egyptian turquoise mining operation that was active for centuries, accompanied by a temple to the goddess Hathor that accumulated votive offerings from miners and officials over many generations. The picture that emerges from all of this evidence is of the Sinai as a fully integrated part of the Egyptian world, a zone of activity and presence that was subjected to the same kind of organized, systematic Egyptian attention as any other part of the kingdom. The desert was not a barrier. It was a resource, a territory, a space to be managed and controlled, and where possible, transformed. And the transformation that the ancient Egyptians were capable of in harsh environments is genuinely astonishing when you look at the evidence. The ability to build in stone, to maintain agricultural systems, to support large populations in environments that modern people would find deeply challenging, speaks to a level of organizational and technical sophistication that we are still working to fully understand. Every new discovery in the Sinai, like every new discovery at Giza or along the Nile, adds another piece to the puzzle of a civilization that was, in its way, as accomplished and as impressive as any that has ever existed on this earth. The desert, which to an outsider's eyes seems empty and hostile and devoid of human meaning, was to the ancient Egyptians a landscape charged with significance, both dangerous and full of possibility. They crossed it, mined it, built in it, and in places like the Sinai, they even greened it. And the traces they left behind, now emerging from the sand after thousands of years, are telling us that their relationship with this apparently inimical environment was far more active, far more creative, and far more lasting than anyone had imagined. The reign of the pharaoh Akhenaten is one of the most debated and disputed periods in all of ancient Egyptian history. There are few figures from antiquity who have attracted more attention, more controversy, or more dramatically divergent interpretations than the strange, visionary, possibly fanatical pharaoh who reigned for approximately 17 years during the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom, around 1353 to 1336 BCE, and who during that time attempted something that no Egyptian ruler had ever attempted before and none would attempt again. He tried to change the religion of Egypt, not just modify it, not just add a new deity to the already crowded Egyptian pantheon, not just elevate one god above the others in the kind of theological prioritizing that had happened before in Egyptian history. Akhenaten tried to abolish the traditional polytheism of Egypt entirely and replace it with the worship of a single divine force, the Aten, the visible disk of the sun. He closed the temples of the other gods, suppressed their cults, directed the enormous wealth of the temple system toward the new religion, and built an entirely new capital city in the desert, a city he named Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, in the place now called Tel el Amarna in Middle Egypt. This radical religious revolution is called the Amarna period after the modern name of its capital, and its aftershocks have been reverberating through Egyptology ever since it was first recognized as a distinct historical episode in the 19th century. The Amarna period raises questions that remain contentious to this day. What motivated Akhenaten's revolution? Was it genuine religious conviction, a mystical experience of the divine that convinced him monotheism was the truth? Was it a political power grab, an attempt to break the power of the traditional priestly establishment, particularly the powerful priesthood of Amen at Karnak, which had grown so wealthy and influential as to constitute a potential challenge to royal authority? Was it some combination of both, or something else entirely? And then there is the question of influence. How far did Akhenaten's radical ideas actually spread? The traditional scholarly view has been that Atenism was essentially a court religion, confined to Akhetaten and its immediate environs, imposed by the power of the state rather than adopted by widespread popular conviction, and therefore capable of being relatively quickly reversed after Akhenaten's death, when his successors, including the boy king Tutankhamun, whose famous tomb with its extraordinary treasures was discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, restored the traditional religion and returned to the worship of Amen. But a remarkable recent discovery is challenging this conventional picture. Archaeologists working at a site near Alexandria, in the far north of Egypt, in the Delta region that is geographically remote from the heart of Akhenaten's revolution, have uncovered a 3,400-year-old city that shows evidence, previously unexpected in this location, that the Aten cult had a presence here, far further north than Akhenaten's known center of power. The city itself is a fascinating discovery in its own right. Dating to the time of the late 18th dynasty, it represents a substantial settlement in a part of Egypt that is not especially well represented in the archaeological record, partly because the Nile Delta, with its high water table and ongoing human habitation, is a notoriously difficult environment for preservation. Finding a well-preserved urban site from this period in this location is significant in itself. But what makes it even more significant is the evidence of Atenist cult activity at the site. The key artifact is a wine jug, decorated with imagery and inscriptions that link it unmistakably to the worship of the Aten. Wine jugs might seem like modest evidence on which to build major historical conclusions, but in the ancient world, wine was not an everyday commodity. It was a luxury item, produced in limited quantities and associated primarily with elite consumption and religious ritual. Wine jars from specific vineyards were labeled with information about their contents and their origin, and these labels have proven to be invaluable historical documents. A wine jug decorated with Atenist imagery found in a city near Alexandria tells us that the cult of the Aten was present here, being practiced by people wealthy and connected enough to be receiving luxury goods at a site far from Akhetaten. This matters because it suggests that the Amarna revolution was not quite as geographically limited as the traditional picture suggests. The ideas of Akhenaten, his insistence on the singular divinity of the Aten, his poetic vision of a god who was accessible to the king directly without the mediation of a priestly establishment, his representation of the divine in terms of light and warmth rather than in the complex mythological narratives of traditional Egyptian religion, these ideas apparently reached further, penetrated more deeply into Egyptian society and more widely across its geography than we had thought. This does not mean that Atenism was a popular mass movement, that ordinary Egyptians across the country enthusiastically abandoned their traditional gods and embraced the new religion. The evidence does not support that conclusion. What it does suggest is that the influence of Akhenaten's court extended further geographically than the confined world of Akhetaten itself, that there were people in northern Egypt, possibly officials or merchants or military men who had spent time at the new capital and been exposed to its religious culture, who carried Atenist practices with them when they returned to their home regions. And this, in turn, raises the intriguing possibility that the reversal of Akhenaten's revolution after his death was not as complete as the official record suggests. If Atenist ideas and practices had spread to communities across Egypt, then the closing of Akhenaten and the restoration of the traditional cults, while certainly effective at eliminating the formal, state-sponsored version of Atenism, may not have eradicated every trace of the new religion from the private practices of ordinary people. The story of Akhenaten's revolution is intimately connected to some of the most enduring mysteries of ancient Egyptian history. Who was his successor before Tutankhamun? The shadowy figure known as Smenkhkare, who may have been a co-regent during the last years of Akhenaten's reign, is one of the most debated identities in Egyptology. Was Smenkhkare male or female? Some Egyptologists have argued that Smenkhkare was in fact Akhenaten's chief wife, the famous Nefertiti, adopting a new royal identity as her husband's health declined. If so, Nefertiti, whose famous painted limestone bust is one of the most recognizable images from the ancient world, may herself have briefly ruled Egypt as pharaoh, making her another entry in the fascinating and surprisingly long list of women who exercised royal power in ancient Egypt. Nefertiti herself is a figure of extraordinary fascination. Her name means the beautiful one has come, and the famous bust found at Amarna, now in the News Museum in Berlin, shows a woman of striking, almost geometrically perfect beauty, with high cheekbones, a long elegant neck, and a serene, slightly distant expression. But the bust is a representation, a piece of propaganda as much as a portrait, and the real Nefertiti, the woman behind the image, remains elusive. We know she was Akhenaten's chief queen, the mother of several of his daughters, and apparently a figure of considerable religious and political importance in her own right. She is depicted in Amarna reliefs performing religious rituals on equal terms with her husband, smiting enemies in the traditional pharaonic manner, and generally occupying a role that goes beyond the usual position of a royal consort. Whether she ultimately became pharaoh herself, whether her mummy has ever been found and identified, whether she survived Akhenaten or died before him, these are questions that remain open, the subject of ongoing scholarly debate and occasional dramatic announcements of new discoveries. What we can say about the Amarna period with confidence is that it was a time of extraordinary upheaval in Egyptian civilization, a period when the most fundamental assumptions of Egyptian society, about the nature of the divine, about the proper relationship between kings and gods and people, about the organization of religious life and the purpose of art and architecture, were subjected to radical challenge and dramatic change. The art of the Amarna period is unlike the art of any other period of Egyptian history. Where traditional Egyptian art represented the human body in a formal, idealized way, with faces in profile, bodies in three-quarter view, and proportions conforming to strict canonical rules, Amarna art broke all of these conventions. The human body in Amarna reliefs and statues is elongated, almost distorted, with narrow shoulders, wide hips, a protruding belly, and an enormous, egg-shaped head. The face is similarly elongated, with half-closed, heavy-lidded eyes, full lips, and a chin that recedes below a dramatically prominent jaw. For a long time, Egyptologists assumed that this distinctive style was a direct reflection of Akhenaten's own unusual physical appearance, that the pharaoh really did look like his portraits, and that the artists of the period were, for the first time in Egyptian artistic history, representing their royal patron realistically rather than ideally. Medical speculation about Akhenaten's possible physical conditions, ranging from Marfan syndrome to gynecomastia to various other conditions that might produce the elongated limbs and unusual body shape of the portraits, has filled a great many academic pages. But more recent scholarship tends toward a different interpretation. Rather than reading the Amarna style as realistic portraiture, most Egyptologists now see it as a deliberate artistic choice, a way of representing Akhenaten in a way that emphasized his superhuman, divine nature. The elongated, ambiguous body of the king in Amarna art may be a representation of divine androgyny, the idea that the creator god contains within himself both male and female principles. By depicting himself in this way, Akhenaten was making a theological statement, presenting his own body as a symbol of the all-encompassing, self-sufficient divine power of the Aten. Whether or not this interpretation is correct, the art of the Amarna period stands as one of the most striking artistic revolutions in the ancient world, a body of work that even today, 4,000 years after it was created, has the power to disturb and unsettle, to make us feel that we are looking at something genuinely strange. Something that breaks with all the conventions we associate with ancient Egypt and presents us with a vision of humanity and divinity that is disquieting in its intensity. And then, almost as suddenly as it began, it was over. Akhenaten died, the circumstances unclear. His successors, through a combination of genuine religious conviction and political calculation, reversed his revolution. Tutankhamun, crowned as Tutankhaten with the Aten still in his name, changed his name to Tutankhamun, restored the name of Amun, and began the process of returning Egypt to its traditional religious framework. Akhenaten was abandoned and eventually quarried for its stone. Akhenaten's images were defaced and his name chiseled from monuments. The priests of Amun came back and the temples reopened, and the old gods reclaimed their place in the Egyptian cosmos. But Akhenaten could not be entirely erased, any more than Hatshepsut could be. The traces he left behind were too extensive, too deeply embedded in the stone and soil of Egypt to be completely removed, and the discovery of Atenist artifacts far from his capital, in a city near Alexandria, suggests that the ideas he championed spread further and lingered longer than his enemies would have wished. The radical pharaoh of Amarna, the dreamer who tried to remake Egypt's relationship with the divine, continues to haunt Egyptology and to raise questions that do not have easy answers. And that perhaps is fitting. The most important questions rarely do. The story of Akhenaten and the Amarna revolution leads us naturally toward questions of legacy, of what persists and what disappears when a reign ends and a new pharaoh begins. And this in turn leads us to one of the most enduring and most human aspects of ancient Egyptian civilization, its engagement with death, with the afterlife, with the preservation of the body and the soul for a journey that the Egyptians believed would last for all eternity. The ancient Egyptian approach to death and afterlife was one of the most elaborate and most thoroughly worked out in the entire ancient world. It involved a complex theology about the nature of the soul, the judgment of the dead, the rewards of the righteous, and the fate of the unjust. It involved an extraordinary practical technology of preservation in the form of mummification, the process of treating a dead body with chemicals and resins, and special wrapping techniques in order to keep it intact for the soul's eventual return. It involved the construction of tombs that were essentially eternal homes for the deceased, furnished with everything the dead person would need to continue a comfortable existence in the afterlife. And it involved the maintenance of cult establishments dedicated to the memory and spiritual welfare of the deceased, employing priests who would make offerings and perform rituals for centuries after the person's death. The royal tombs of ancient Egypt are among the most famous archaeological sites in the world. The Valley of the Kings, the remote desert valley on the west bank of the Nile at Luxor, where the pharaohs of the New Kingdom were buried in elaborate rock-cut tombs, has been a site of excavation and discovery since at least the Roman period, when tourists carved their names and comments on the walls of the tombs they visited. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb by Howard Carter in November 1922 was arguably the most spectacular archaeological find of the 20th century, a tomb that had survived nearly intact for more than 3,000 years, its contents including more than 5,000 objects of extraordinary craftsmanship and historical importance. The golden mask of Tutankhamun, the gilded shrines, the ceremonial weapons and chariots and jewelry, all of it together represents an unparalleled window into the material culture of the New Kingdom royal court. But while Tutankhamun's tomb dominates popular consciousness, the reality of ancient Egyptian royal and elite burial practices is far more varied and far more interesting than any single tomb, however spectacular, can convey. And in recent years, discoveries at various burial sites across Egypt have been adding remarkable new dimensions to our understanding of how the ancient Egyptians dealt with death and what they believed about what came after. One of the most significant recent discoveries in the realm of tomb archaeology has been at Saqqara, the ancient necropolis that served as the burial ground for Memphis, and that contains tombs dating from the earliest dynasties of Egyptian history through the Ptolemaic period, a span of more than 3,000 years of continuous funerary activity. Saqqara is an enormous site, much of which remains unexcavated, and it continues to yield extraordinary discoveries with remarkable frequency. Among the most remarkable recent finds at Saqqara is the tomb of a figure known as Prince User Referee, a royal official whose tomb proved to contain not just the expected burial goods and inscriptions, but a window into the complex social and religious world of elite Egyptians at a specific moment in their civilization's long history. The tomb, when excavated, revealed a wealth of material that speaks to the sophistication of Egyptian religious thought and the elaborate preparations that wealthy individuals made for their journey to the afterlife. The physical design of Egyptian elite tombs during the major periods was not arbitrary. Every chamber, every corridor, every image on the walls had a specific purpose and a specific meaning within the overall theological program of the tomb. The entrance areas and outer chambers, which living people could visit, were designed to encourage the performance of the mortuary cult, the regular offerings of food, drink, and incense that were believed to nourish the deceased spirit and allow it to continue existing in the afterlife. The walls of these outer areas were decorated with images of daily life, idealized scenes of abundance and activity that were intended to magically ensure the deceased would continue to enjoy these things in the afterlife. Scenes of harvesting, of hunting and fishing, of feasting and music and dancing, of agricultural work and craft production were all represented in glorious painted detail, creating a permanent record of everything that made life worth living and ensuring, through the magical power of image and word, that these things would continue to be available to the dead person. The inner chambers of the tomb, accessible only to priests performing specific rituals, were decorated with religious texts and imagery concerned with the journey of the soul through the underworld, the dangers to be navigated, the gates to be passed, the divine beings to be encountered, the judgment of the dead before the court of Osiris. These texts, known collectively as coffin texts in the Middle Kingdom period and as the Book of the Dead in the New Kingdom, were a kind of spiritual roadmap, a guide to the afterlife that equipped the deceased with the knowledge and the magical formulae needed to navigate successfully to the eternal paradise the Egyptians called the Field of Reeds. The mummification process itself, the physical technology through which the Egyptians sought to preserve the body for eternity, is one of the most fascinating aspects of their civilization and one that modern science is revealing in increasingly extraordinary detail. The basic principles of mummification were well understood even before modern scientific methods were applied to the subject. The Egyptians removed most of the internal organs which decay rapidly, treated the body with natron, a naturally occurring salt, to draw out moisture and prevent bacterial growth, and then wrapped the desiccated body in many layers of linen bandages, often interleaved with amulets and other protective objects. The brain was typically removed through the nose using a special hook, while the heart, considered the seat of intelligence and the organ that would be weighed against a feather in the judgment of the dead, was left in place. The removed organs were preserved separately in canopic jars, each protected by one of the four sons of Horus. This process, in its most elaborate and careful form as practiced on royal mummies, produced results of remarkable durability. The mummies of Egypt's pharaohs, when discovered in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the Great Cache at Deir el-Bahari, where they had been reburied by priests of the 21st dynasty to protect them from tomb robbers, were in many cases extraordinarily well preserved. Faces that had last been seen in life more than 3,000 years before were clearly recognizable as individual human beings, with distinctive features, hair still intact, skin still showing something of its original color and texture. The mummy of Ramesses II, who ruled Egypt for an astonishing 66 years during the 19th dynasty, and who is considered by many to be the greatest pharaoh of the New Kingdom, is one of the most extraordinary mummies ever found. Ramesses II, known also as Ramesses the Great, was a ruler of tremendous ambition and energy who built on a scale that even by Egyptian standards was extraordinary. His building projects included the temples at Abu Simbel, carved directly into a cliff face in Nubia and featuring 4 enormous statues of the seated pharaoh, each more than 20 meters tall, staring out across the desert with an expression of serene divine confidence. He added to temples at Karnak and Luxor. He built his own mortuary temple, the Ramesseum, on the west bank at Thebes. He fought the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh, one of the earliest battles in history for which we have detailed records from both sides, and then negotiated one of the earliest known peace treaties in the historical record, the details of which were recorded both on the walls of Egyptian temples and on cuneiform tablets found in the Hittite capital. When the mummy of Ramesses II was examined in the early 20th century after its discovery in the Deir el-Bahari cache, and when it was examined again by French scientists in the 1970s when the mummy was taken to Paris for conservation treatment, the results were startling. The mummy was not just well preserved. It was extraordinarily informative, telling the scientists who examined it a great deal about what Ramesses had looked like, what health problems he had suffered, what had ultimately killed him, and even something about his life history as encoded in the physical evidence of his body. The mummy showed evidence of arthritis, dental disease, arterial disease, and various other conditions that afflict elderly people, consistent with a man who had lived into his 80s or possibly his 90s. His hair was white and reddish. Apparently its natural color had been red, which would have been quite unusual in a dark-haired population. His face, even in death, conveyed something of the imperious self-confidence that his monuments project. Modern scientific techniques applied to Egyptian mummies are revealing things about the ancient Egyptians that no amount of reading inscriptions and studying art could tell us. Genetic analysis is revealing information about the ancestry and family relationships of individuals, sometimes confirming what the historical record suggests and sometimes contradicting it. CT scanning allows researchers to examine mummies in extraordinary detail without unwrapping or damaging them, revealing not just the state of the body but the objects hidden within the wrappings, the amulets and jewelry placed among the bandages during the mummification process. Chemical analysis of mummy tissues is revealing information about diet, disease, exposure to various substances, and even in some cases, the specific materials used in the mummification process itself. One of the most remarkable recent applications of modern technology to the study of Egyptian mummies has been the use of genomic analysis to investigate questions of ancestry, population movement, and family relationship. DNA extracted from mummies from various periods and sites in Egypt has been analyzed in ways that are beginning to reveal the genetic history of the Egyptian population, showing how it changed over time and how it related to other ancient populations in the region and beyond. This work is still in its early stages, as ancient DNA is fragile and easily contaminated, and the preservation conditions in Egypt, while excellent for soft tissue and organic materials generally, are not always ideal for DNA preservation. But the results already emerging are intriguing and in some cases genuinely surprising. The mummification technology itself, of course, did not spring fully formed into existence at the beginning of Egyptian civilization. It evolved over many centuries, becoming progressively more sophisticated as practitioners learned, through trial and error and accumulated experience, which techniques were most effective at preserving the body for the long term. The earliest Egyptian burials from the pre-dynastic period before the unification of Egypt into a single kingdom around 3100 BCE involved placing the body in a simple pit in the desert, where the hot, dry sand naturally desiccated it and produced a kind of spontaneous mummification. The bodies preserved in this way sometimes survived remarkably well, their skin and hair and even their features still recognizable thousands of years later. As the Egyptians began to build more elaborate tombs, the bodies were placed in coffins and chambers rather than directly in the sand, and paradoxically, this meant that the natural desiccating conditions were no longer available. The need to artificially replicate what the desert sand had been doing naturally is what drove the development of formal mummification techniques, which by the New Kingdom had reached a level of sophistication that was not matched anywhere else in the ancient world, and that produced results remarkable enough to have survived to the present day. The science behind mummification as practiced by the ancient Egyptians is, from a modern biochemical perspective, genuinely impressive. The use of natron, the naturally occurring salt mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate with some sodium chloride, to dehydrate the body was a sophisticated application of chemistry. The resins used to coat mummies and to preserve them from insect and bacterial damage were complex organic compounds with genuine antimicrobial properties. Recent chemical analysis of mummy wrappings and mummy tissue has identified specific plant resins, oils, and other substances used in the mummification process, some of which were imported from great distances, including substances that can only have come from tropical regions of Africa or from the Eastern Mediterranean. This tells us something important about the economic networks that supported Egyptian funerary practices. Mummification, at least at its highest levels of quality, was not a simple, locally resourced process. It required access to imported materials, to trade networks that stretched across much of the known ancient world. The myrrh and frankincense imported from Punt, the cedar oil from Lebanon, the various other resins and aromatics that Egyptian embalmers used, these things had to be obtained through the kind of long-distance trading relationships that were a fundamental part of how the Egyptian state functioned. The elaborate death industry of ancient Egypt, the production of tombs and coffins and mummies and grave goods, was deeply embedded in the economic life of the civilization, creating demand for craft production, raw material procurement, and skilled labor that had effects. One thing becomes increasingly clear. Ancient Egypt was not a static, unchanging civilization, frozen in time and repeating the same patterns endlessly for 3,000 years, as it is sometimes caricatured. It was a living, dynamic civilization, constantly evolving, constantly responding to new challenges and new opportunities, producing extraordinary individuals whose choices and visions shaped the course of history in ways that we are still working to fully understand. The Egypt that built the Old Kingdom pyramids was not the same as the Egypt of the New Kingdom pharaohs, even though both shared many of the same fundamental cultural assumptions and religious beliefs. The Egypt of Akhenaten's radical monotheism was not the Egypt of Hatshepsut's orthodox piety, even though both were nominally governed by the same set of royal ideologies. The Egypt that sent trading ships to Punt was not the Egypt that fought the Hittites at Kadesh, even though both were manifestations of the same civilization's engagement with the wider world. What held all of these Egypts together, what made the same civilization across more than 3,000 years of history, was understandings about the nature of the world and humanity's place in it. The concept of Ma'at, that cosmic order which it was the pharaoh's primary duty to maintain, permeated every aspect of Egyptian life and thought. The idea that the cycles of nature, the flooding of the Nile, the movement of the stars, the rising and setting of the sun, were not just physical phenomena but manifestations of divine will and divine order, gave Egyptian civilization a kind of stability and coherence that enabled it to absorb enormous change while maintaining its fundamental character. And that character, that Egyptian character, is what speaks to us so powerfully across the millennia when we look at their monuments, read their texts, examine their mummies, and try to understand what kind of people they were. They were people who took life seriously and death even more seriously. They were people who believed that the beauty they created in this world would outlast them and carry something of their essence into eternity. They were people who loved their families and their homes and their food and their beer and their music and their games. They were people who could be cruel and bureaucratic and rigid and politically calculating. They were also people who could produce the poetry of the great hymn to the Aten, one of the most beautiful religious texts in the ancient world, or the heartbreaking love poetry of the New Kingdom, in which young men and women speak of longing and desire in terms that feel entirely modern and entirely human. We are not so different from them, and the more we discover, the more clearly we see that. Every new tomb excavated at Saqqara, every new scan revealing unknown chambers in the pyramids, every new artifact connecting distant parts of Egypt through trade or religion or royal power, brings us closer to a full understanding of the civilization that has fascinated the world for centuries, and that continues with every passing year of archaeological work to reveal new depths and new complexities and new wonders. The sands of Egypt are still giving up their secrets. The desert still holds more than it has yet revealed. And the story of this extraordinary civilization is still being written, not just by the ancient Egyptians who built it and lived in it and loved it and died in it, but by the modern scholars and scientists who are, grain by grain, brush stroke by brush stroke, scan by scan, uncovering what lies beneath and bringing it back into the light. This is the world of ancient Egypt as it truly was, not the simplified, exoticized, mummy-cursed Egypt of popular imagination, but a real civilization inhabited by real human beings, full of real complexity and real contradiction and real achievement. A civilization that built structures of breathtaking ambition and precision. A civilization that produced literature and art and science of genuine sophistication. A civilization that was embedded in a web of international trade and cultural exchange that stretched across the known ancient world. A civilization that was, above all, remarkably human, driven by the same fundamental desires and fears and hopes and ambitions that drive human beings in every time and every place. The secrets of the sands are being revealed, one discovery at a time. And what they are revealing is not just the distant past of one particular people in one particular place. They are revealing something universal, something that speaks to all of us who have ever looked at the night sky and wondered about our place in the universe, who have ever built something and hoped it would last, who have ever loved someone and feared to lose them, who have ever faced the unknown with a mixture of fear and curiosity and the stubborn human determination to make sense of the world. That is what ancient Egypt is at its deepest level. Not just a collection of monuments and mummies and mysterious texts. It is a mirror held up across the millennia in which we can see ourselves more clearly than we sometimes expect. And the reflection it shows us is both humbling and inspiring, evidence that the things that make us human are not recent inventions but ancient constants, as enduring as the stone of the pyramids, as eternal as the flowing Nile. The story continues, the excavations go on, the scans reveal more anomalies. The chemical analyses produce more surprising results, the mummies yield more genetic secrets, and somewhere out there, beneath the sand that has covered it for 4,500 years, the world's greatest civilization waits for us to find the next piece of its extraordinary, endlessly fascinating puzzle. What we have explored in this first part of our journey is only the beginning. We have stood at the edge of the Nile and watched the royal fleet pass. We have descended metaphorically beneath the Giza plateau, and sense the presence of unknown chambers and tunnels waiting to be explored. We have stood in the shadow of Deir el-Bahari and tried to understand the extraordinary woman who built it. We have crossed the Sinai desert and found, to our astonishment, a tree-lined boulevard carved through the wilderness by a civilization that refused to accept the limitations of its environment. We have followed the trail of a revolutionary pharaoh, whose radical ideas reached further and lasted longer than history had previously suggested. And we have begun to explore the elaborate, sophisticated, and endlessly fascinating world that the ancient Egyptians created around death and the hope of eternal life. But there is more to discover, much more. The tombs of Saqqara are not yet fully revealed. The science of mummification has more secrets to give up. The mummy of Rameses the Great has more to tell us. And the great questions about what lies beneath the Giza plateau, about what happened in those final days of Hatshepsut's reign, about what ultimately became of Akhenaten's radical vision, about what the Sphinx is guarding and what the Valley Temple's calendar was measuring. These questions are still alive, still demanding answers, still driving researchers to push deeper into the desert and further into the ancient world than anyone has gone before. The journey continues, the sand is still shifting, and the secrets of ancient Egypt are still being told. The desert does not give up its secrets easily. It holds them with the same patient, implacable grip with which it holds everything else that falls within its reach, the bones of animals, the ruins of cities, the dreams of civilizations that rose and fell and rose again across thousands of years of human history. But it does give them up, eventually. Time and the work of dedicated, passionate, endlessly curious human beings conspire to pull back the curtain of sand and silence, and what emerges from beneath is always more remarkable, more complex, more moving than anyone had dared to hope. We left our story at a moment of anticipation, standing at the threshold of discoveries that are still unfolding, surrounded by questions that have not yet found their answers and mysteries that have not yet yielded to the patient pressure of scholarship and science. We had traveled along the Nile in the company of royal fleets, descended beneath the plateau of Giza to sense the presence of unknown chambers, stood in the shadow of Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahari, crossed the Sinai desert to find green boulevards carved through wilderness, and followed the radical trail of Akhenaten's religious revolution to its unexpected northern outpost. We had begun to enter the extraordinary world that ancient Egypt built around its relationship with death, with the afterlife, with the preservation of the body and the journey of the soul. Now we go deeper. Now we press further into the tombs and the science, further into the lives of the pharaohs and the people who served them, further into the mysteries that remain and the discoveries that are reshaping our understanding of this civilization with every passing year. The story of ancient Egypt is not finished. It will never be finished because every answer generates new questions, and the desert is deep, and the civilization that left its marks upon it was vast and complex and breathtakingly prolific. What follows is the continuation of that story, picking up where we left off and pressing onward into the extraordinary depth and richness of a world that has been waiting, beneath the sand, for us to find it. The necropolis of Saqqara stretches across the desert plateau above the ancient city of Memphis like a vast, silent city of the dead, its surface broken by the stepped silhouette of the step pyramid of Djoser, the oldest large-scale world, and by the hundreds of mastaba tombs, pyramid structures, and shaft tombs that accumulated here over more than 3,000 years of funerary activity. Saqqara was the primary burial ground for Memphis and for the officials and courtiers who served the pharaohs whose capital it was, and the density of tombs, their variety, and the sheer span of time they represent make it one of the richest and most complex archaeological sites anywhere on Earth. The step pyramid itself deserves a moment of attention before we descend into the stories of the tombs and the mummies that are our primary focus, because it represents a moment in human history of extraordinary significance. Before the step pyramid, monumental architecture in Egypt was built of mud brick. Stone was used for specific elements, for flooring, for door surrounds, for certain ritual objects, but the construction of large buildings from stone was not yet part of the Egyptian architectural repertoire. The decision to build a royal tomb entirely from stone, and not just in the simple block construction that might seem the obvious first step, but in a complex, multi-tiered structure that rose to a height of more than 60 meters, was a conceptual and technical leap of staggering boldness. The man who made this leap, whose genius is encoded in every course of limestone that makes up the step pyramid and its surrounding complex, was Imhotep, the chief architect of the pharaoh Djoser. Imhotep is one of the most remarkable individuals in the entire ancient world, a man of such obvious genius and such wide-ranging intellectual gifts that he was deified after his death, worshipped for centuries as a god of wisdom and medicine, and eventually equated by the Greeks with their own god of healing, Asclepius. Almost nothing is known about Imhotep the man, the human being behind the legend, but the pyramid he designed stands as his monument, as eloquent a testament to a single individual's vision as anything in the ancient world. The complex surrounding the step pyramid, which Imhotep designed not just as a tomb, but as an eternal setting for the continued ritual life of the dead pharaoh, anticipated the structure of later pyramid complexes in many ways and introduced architectural elements, particularly the use of engaged columns with papyrus and lotus capitals, that would become fundamental to Egyptian architecture for the next 3,000 years. Walking through what survives of this complex today, even in its ruined state, you can feel the ambition and the intelligence of its creator, the sense of someone who was not just solving a technical problem but articulating a vision of eternity in stone. It is in the shadow of this astonishing structure, and across the vast plateau that surrounds it, that some of the most exciting recent archaeological work in Egypt has been taking place. And the discoveries being made at Saqqara in recent years have been so spectacular, so densely packed with extraordinary finds, that even seasoned archaeologists have expressed something close to disbelief at what is coming out of the ground. The tomb of Prince User-Referee, which we touched on briefly in our first part, is one example of a broader pattern of discovery that has been transforming our understanding of elite Egyptian burial practices. What is particularly striking about this tomb and others like it recently excavated at Saqqara is not just the richness of their contents, though the contents are indeed extraordinary, but the window they provide into the specific historical moment of their creation, the particular pressures and opportunities and religious ideas that shaped how this individual chose to prepare for eternity. Prince User-Referee lived during a period when Egyptian royal ideology and the theology of the afterlife were undergoing significant developments. The elaborate religious texts and artistic programs that decorated his tomb, reflect not just generic Egyptian beliefs about death and the afterlife, but the specific theological concerns of his era, the particular way in which his generation understood the journey of the soul and the nature of the divine realm it was destined to enter. Reading these texts and images carefully, with the kind of close attention that modern Egyptology brings to bear, reveals a picture of extraordinary theological sophistication, a civilization that had been thinking seriously about these questions for more than 1,000 years before this tomb was cut, and had developed answers of remarkable complexity and subtlety. The burial goods found in tombs like this one also tell important stories. The objects placed in an Egyptian tomb were not random collections of valuable things. They were carefully chosen according to specific theological requirements, specific ideas about what the dead person would need in the afterlife, and what kinds of magical protection would be most useful on the journey through the underworld. Shabtis, small figurines that were intended to perform agricultural labor on behalf of the deceased in the afterlife, were present in enormous numbers in elite tombs, sometimes hundreds of them, one for each day of the year plus additional overseer figures. Amulets of various types, each associated with specific protective deities or magical properties, were woven into the mummy wrappings and placed throughout the burial. Food offerings contained in vessels of pottery, stone, and sometimes precious metals represented the continued sustenance of the soul. Books of the dead, papyrus scrolls inscribed with the religious texts and magical formulae that would guide the deceased through the underworld, were placed within easy reach of the mummy. The production of all this funerary equipment was itself a major industry, supporting large numbers of craftsmen, scribes, painters, weavers, and other specialists who made their living supplying the needs of the dead. The workshops that produced funerary goods were often located near the major necropolises, and the scale of production they must have achieved, given the enormous number of tombs in places like Saqqara and the Valley of the Kings and the cemeteries of Akhetaten, speaks to a funerary economy of very substantial size. Death in ancient Egypt was good for business. Recent excavations at Saqqara have also revealed something that has sparked enormous excitement among Egyptologists and among the wider public that follows these discoveries with such intense interest. A series of sealed burial shafts cut deep into the bedrock of the plateau have been found to contain not just single burials but multiple coffins, sometimes dozens of them, stacked in shafts that went down many meters into the rock. These coffins, dating primarily to the late period of Egyptian history, the centuries just before the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE, are in many cases extraordinarily well preserved, their painted wooden surfaces still vivid with the bright colors applied more than 2,500 years ago. The images on these coffins are a feast for the eyes and a treasure trove for scholars. Every surface is covered with religious imagery and text, with representations of gods and goddesses, with scenes from the mythological narratives of death and resurrection, with the sacred eyes of Horus, with the jed pillar of Osiris, with the winged scarab of Khepri representing the renewal of the sun and the resurrection of the dead. The quality of the craftsmanship varies from coffin to coffin, reflecting the different budgets and priorities of the individuals and families who commissioned them, but even the less elaborate examples are skilled work, products of a tradition of funerary art that had been developing and refining itself for thousands of years. Inside the coffins, the mummies themselves have been examined using the full range of modern scientific techniques, and what they are revealing is a remarkably detailed picture of the health, diet, ancestry, and life histories of the people of late-period Egypt. These were not pharaohs or great nobles, but members of the broader elite, priests and officials and prosperous merchants, people who could afford a proper burial but who were not at the very pinnacle of Egyptian society. Their mummies show the effects of hard work and aging, the arthritis and dental disease and various injuries that accumulate in the body of someone who has lived a full life in the ancient world. Their genetics reveal patterns of ancestry and family relationship that are filling in the picture of late-period Egyptian population genetics in ways that were not possible even a decade ago. The science of mummification, which we began to explore in Part 1, deserves much deeper examination, because the advances in our understanding of this practice that have come from modern scientific analysis are nothing short of revolutionary. For many years, the study of Egyptian mummification was conducted primarily through the examination of finished mummies and through the reading of ancient texts that describe the process in varying degrees of detail. The Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, provided what was for a long time the most detailed ancient description of mummification, outlining 3 different grades of the treatment available at different price points, from the elaborate full treatment given to the wealthy to the more basic, cheaper options available to those of more modest means. But Herodotus was an outsider looking at a foreign practice with a mixture of fascination and mild distaste, and his description, while valuable, is inevitably incomplete and probably inaccurate in some details. The Egyptians themselves did not produce comprehensive technical manuals for mummification, at least none that has survived, and the religious texts associated with funerary practice deal with the theological and ritual dimensions of the process rather than its practical, technical aspects. So for a long time, our understanding of exactly what materials were used in what quantities at what stages of the process, and with what specific effects on the body's preservation was quite limited. Modern chemistry has changed all of that. Chemical analysis of mummy wrappings, mummy tissues, and the residues found in the vessels associated with mummification workshops has revealed the specific substances used in the process in extraordinary detail. Some of these substances were exactly what the ancient texts and common sense would have suggested. Natron, the naturally occurring salt, was indeed widely used as the primary desiccant. Various plant oils were used to coat the body and the wrappings. Linen from the finest workshops was used for the inner wrappings closest to the body. But the chemical analyses have also revealed some genuine surprises, substances that were used in mummification that the existing evidence had not previously suggested, and substances whose presence reveals fascinating things about the trade networks and the pharmacological knowledge of ancient Egyptian embalmers. Certain resins that have been identified in mummy wrappings and mummy tissue samples can only have come from specific plant species that are not native to Egypt, requiring their importation from tropical Africa or from the Eastern Mediterranean. The presence of these materials tells us about the reach of Egyptian trade networks and about the value placed on specific substances for their preservative properties, a value significant enough to justify their transport over very long distances at very considerable expense. One of the most remarkable recent discoveries in the chemistry of mummification came from the analysis of a mummification workshop discovered at Saqqara, a facility that appears to have been actively used during the late period, roughly 650 to 300 BCE. This workshop contained pottery vessels, many of them labeled in ink with the names of their contents that had held the various substances used in the mummification process. Chemical analysis of the residues remaining in these vessels has identified an extraordinary variety of substances, including plant oils, animal fats, specific resins imported from the Eastern Mediterranean and possibly from sub-Saharan Africa, and various other organic compounds whose specific identities and sources are still being worked out. The labels on the vessels are particularly valuable because they give us the Egyptian names for these substances and in some cases instructions for their use, which stages of the mummification process they were intended for and what specific effects they were expected to have. This allows researchers to begin constructing a much more detailed picture of the mummification process as actually practiced, step by step, than has been possible before. It also, in some cases, allows the identification of previously unknown Egyptian names for specific substances and the matching of those names to chemically identified compounds, advancing our understanding of the ancient Egyptian pharmacological and chemical vocabulary. The workshop also contained evidence of the spatial organization of the mummification process, different areas apparently dedicated to different stages of treatment, from the initial preparation of the body through the application of the various preservative substances to the final wrapping and preparation for entombment. This gives us a much more concrete picture of what a working mummification establishment looked like and how it functioned, replacing the somewhat vague and impressionistic picture that previous evidence had allowed with something much more specific and operational. Beyond the workshop itself, the mummies produced at facilities like this one, when examined with modern imaging technology, reveal the extraordinary skill and care that went into the preparation of elite burials. CT scanning of mummies has revealed the precise placement of amulets within the wrappings, the specific types of objects used for different parts of the body, and the elaborate care taken to present the mummy in a posture and condition appropriate to its eternal role. It has also revealed evidence of the embalming incisions used to remove internal organs, the packing materials used to restore the body's natural contours after organ removal, and the various other technical interventions of the embalmer's art. In some cases, CT scanning has revealed things that were quite unexpected. Mummies that appeared from the outside to be intact and well preserved have been found to contain bones in disarray within the wrappings, suggesting that the mummy was disturbed and rewrapped at some point in antiquity, possibly by tomb robbers who stripped the wrappings in search of the amulets and jewelry interleaved with them. Other mummies have revealed unexpected objects within the wrappings, additional amulets or small figurines that had not been visible on the exterior. And in a few remarkable cases, CT scanning has revealed the presence of not one mummy within a set of wrappings but multiple individuals, cases where remains were apparently combined during rewrapping, sometimes by accident and sometimes perhaps deliberately. The study of ancient mummies is also advancing our understanding of the health and disease of ancient Egyptians in ways that have significant implications beyond pure historical interest. The identification of specific disease organisms, parasites, and pathological conditions in mummy tissue is building a picture of the disease environment of ancient Egypt that complements, and in some cases, challenges what we might have assumed from historical and archaeological evidence. Malaria, for example, has been identified in several ancient Egyptian mummies through the detection of antigens associated with the malaria parasite, confirming that this disease was present in ancient Egypt and giving us direct evidence of its historical impact. Tuberculosis has similarly been identified, as have various parasitic infections associated with exposure to the waters of the Nile and its irrigation systems. Cardiovascular disease, long thought to be primarily a product of modern sedentary lifestyles and poor diets, has been found to have been surprisingly common among ancient Egyptians, including among royal mummies whose diet would have been rich in meat and fat. This suggests that cardiovascular disease may have deeper roots in human biology and genetics than was previously assumed, a finding with obvious implications for modern medicine as well as for our understanding of ancient health. And genetics, as already mentioned, is perhaps the most rapidly advancing frontier in the study of ancient Egyptians. The ancient DNA extracted from mummies and skeletal remains is allowing researchers to ask questions about ancestry, family relationship, population movement, and genetic disease that would have been completely unanswerable even 20 years ago. The results are sometimes confirming what the historical record suggests, as in the case of family relationships between royal mummies that can now be verified or refuted through genetic testing. But they are also sometimes surprising, revealing patterns of ancestry or genetic relationship that the historical evidence alone would not have predicted. The mummy of Ramesses II, which we introduced in our first part as one of the most extraordinary preserved bodies from the ancient world, deserves considerably more attention here, because the story of his mummy and the scientific investigations conducted on it is a remarkable narrative in its own right, one that connects the ancient world to the modern one in ways that are both scientifically fascinating and deeply humanizing. Ramesses II reigned for 66 years, from approximately 1279 to 1213 BCE, a span of time so extraordinary that he outlived most of his children and several of his senior officials. He was a prolific builder on a scale that even Egyptian standards could barely encompass, leaving his mark on temples and monuments from the Nile Delta in the north to deep into Nubia in the south. He was also a prolific father, fathering well over 100 children by his various wives and consorts, and a successful military commander who, if he did not quite achieve the clear military victories his propaganda claimed, at least managed the delicate diplomatic art of transforming a military near disaster at Kadesh into a celebrated triumph that was commemorated on temple walls across Egypt for the remainder of his reign. His mummy, found in the Deir el-Bahari cache in 1881 and transferred to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo where it has remained, was first scientifically examined in detail in the early 20th century and then, in a remarkable episode that itself tells an important story about the intersection of ancient history and modern politics, taken to France in 1976 for conservation treatment and scientific examination. The mummy had been deteriorating, attacked by fungal growth that was threatening its survival, and French scientists had both the expertise and the facilities to treat it. The Egyptian government agreed to allow the transfer, and Ramesses II made his first journey outside of Egypt in more than 3,000 years. What happened when the mummy arrived in France was extraordinary. The French government received Ramesses II with the full honors due to a head of state. His mummy was met at the airport by a guard of honor, was transported with official ceremony, and was addressed in public announcements using his full royal titles and the honorific form appropriate to a visiting monarch. It was a gesture at once politically savvy and genuinely moving, an acknowledgement that whatever his technical status as an ancient artifact, there was something about Ramesses II that commanded respect beyond the category of archaeological specimen. He was and had always been a king. The scientific examination of the mummy during this visit produced remarkable results. The body was subjected to X-ray analysis, microscopic examination of hair and skin samples, and various other tests that together painted an extraordinarily detailed picture of who Ramesses II had been physically. His height was determined to be approximately 170 centimeters, quite tall for an ancient Egyptian man. His hair, as already noted, was white with a reddish tint, with analysis suggesting that the reddish color was at least partly natural and not solely the result of the henna that was apparently applied to his hair after death, a detail that opens fascinating questions about the population genetics of ancient Egyptian royal families. His face, even in its mummified state, retained enough of its original character for researchers to describe the features with confidence: a long, narrow face with a strong hooked nose, features that are consistent with his portrait statues and the numerous painted representations of him that survive from his reign. The examination also revealed important information about his health. Ramesses suffered from severe dental disease, with multiple teeth either missing or severely worn, and with evidence of dental abscesses that must have caused him considerable pain during his lifetime. He had arthritis in his hips and spine, consistent with a long life of physical activity, possibly including riding in the chariot charges that were such a feature of New Kingdom warfare. His arteries showed evidence of atherosclerosis, the hardening and narrowing of the arteries that is associated with cardiovascular disease. And there was evidence that he had suffered from an infection in the final period of his life, possibly contributing to his death. But beyond these specific medical findings, the examination of Ramesses II's mummy conveyed something more intangible and more profound. Here was a man who had lived 3,000 years ago, who had wielded more power than almost any individual in the ancient world, who had left his mark on one of history's greatest civilizations in ways that can still be seen and touched today, and whose physical remains were sufficient for modern scientists to reconstruct not just his appearance but something of his experience, the pain of his dental abscesses, the stiffness of his arthritic joints, the gradual narrowing of his arteries as he aged. The distance of 3,000 years collapsed in the examination room of a French museum, and what was left was just a human being, remarkable and powerful and ultimately subject to all the same physical frailties and limitations as every other human being who has ever lived. Ramesses II is also at the center of one of the most persistent and most debated questions in the intersection of ancient Egyptian history and biblical scholarship: the question of whether he was the pharaoh of the Exodus. The biblical narrative of the Israelite enslavement in Egypt and their eventual escape under the leadership of Moses is one of the foundational stories of three major world religions, and the question of whether and how this narrative relates to historical events in ancient Egypt has been debated by scholars for well over a century. Ramesses II, with his massive building programs that certainly involved large numbers of laborers, his long reign that fits some calculations of biblical chronology, and his prominent role in later Jewish and Christian tradition, has been the most commonly proposed candidate for the pharaoh of the Exodus. Egyptian records do not contain any direct account of the Exodus, which has led some scholars to conclude that the event as described in the Bible did not happen in historical terms, or happened on a scale too small to register in the official record. Others argue that Egyptian official records were deliberately focused on victories and achievements and would not have recorded a disaster like the loss of an enslaved workforce. The debate continues, as it probably will continue indefinitely, because the evidence is genuinely ambiguous and the stakes, both scholarly and religious, are high enough to ensure that no easy consensus will emerge. What archaeology can tell us with increasing clarity is what life was like for the various categories of people who lived and worked in Egypt during the New Kingdom, including those who were brought to Egypt as prisoners of war or forced laborers from various conquered territories. And what it tells us is a story of considerable complexity, a society in which people of many different origins and statuses lived and worked within the Egyptian system, sometimes under conditions of extreme hardship and sometimes with considerable autonomy and even opportunity, depending on their skills, their connections, and the specific circumstances of their situation. The Valley of the Kings, that narrow desert ravine on the west bank of the Nile at Luxor, where the pharaohs of the New Kingdom chose to cut their eternal resting places deep into the limestone cliffs, is one of those places where the weight of human history is almost physically palpable. The valley is hot and dry and quiet, enclosed by high limestone walls that glow golden in the morning sun and turn deep orange at sunset. The entrances to the tombs are cut into the cliff face or into the valley floor, some of them now open to visitors and fitted with electric lights that illuminate the painted corridors and chambers, others still closed to the public or still being excavated and studied. More than 60 royal and non-royal tombs have been identified in the Valley of the Kings, ranging from elaborate multi-chambered complexes that extend more than 100 meters into the rock to simpler, smaller tombs that may never have been completed or used. The quality and the quantity of decoration in these tombs varies enormously, reflecting both the resources and the reigns of the different pharaohs who built them, but the underlying theological program, the desire to provide the king with a secure passage through the underworld and a guaranteed resurrection, is consistent across all of them. The famous tomb of Tutankhamun, designated KV62 in the valley's cataloging system, is by far the smallest royal tomb in the valley, a cramped, almost accidental-seeming space that appears to have been prepared in haste for a king who died unexpectedly young and had not yet had time to complete a proper tomb of his own. The extraordinary contents of the tomb, the treasures that Howard Carter spent a decade carefully removing and documenting after their discovery in 1922, were crammed into this small space with what appears to have been considerable difficulty. Some of the larger objects show evidence of having been disassembled for transport and reassembled inside the tomb. The disorder of some areas of the burial, which had clearly been entered by tomb robbers in antiquity and then hastily resealed by royal officials, adds another dimension of drama to an already remarkable story. The scientific study of Tutankhamun himself has been extensive and ongoing. His mummy, examined multiple times using increasingly sophisticated techniques, has revealed a young man of approximately 18 to 20 years of age at death, with a variety of physical conditions including a clubfoot, evidence of malaria infection, and a complex fracture of his left leg that some researchers have suggested may have contributed to his death. Genetic analysis of Tutankhamun and other royal mummies from his era has shed important light on the family relationships of the Amarna royal family, confirming that Tutankhamun was indeed the son of Akhenaten, and revealing a pattern of close royal family intermarriage that may have contributed to the various physical conditions identified in the mummies. The question of how Tutankhamun died has been the subject of intense debate and has attracted enormous public interest, generating competing theories involving murder, chariot accident, hunting accident, infection from the leg fracture, and genetic disease resulting from generations of close family intermarriage. The truth is that the evidence is insufficient to allow a definitive answer. The fracture of the left leg was certainly a serious injury, and in the ancient world, even seemingly minor injuries could be fatal if they led to infection. Whether the fracture was sustained shortly before death or earlier in his life, and whether it directly contributed to his death or was incidental to it, remains genuinely uncertain. What is less uncertain is the historical context of Tutankhamun's reign and its importance in the broader narrative of Egyptian history. Tutankhamun came to the throne as a child, probably no more than 8 or 9 years old, in the immediate aftermath of the Amarna Revolution. His reign, though short, was one of the most politically consequential in Egyptian history, because it was during this time that the definitive reversal of Akhenaten's reforms was accomplished and Egypt returned to the religious and administrative framework of the pre-Amarna world. The young king himself may have had little personal agency in these decisions, which were almost certainly driven by the senior officials who served as his regents and advisors, most notably a general named Horemheb and a royal official named Ai, who would both eventually become pharaoh themselves. The return to orthodoxy under Tutankhamun involved not just the reopening of the traditional temples and the restoration of the traditional cult practices, but an active process of restoration and renewal. Temples that had been damaged or neglected during the Amarna period were repaired and refurbished. Statues of the traditional gods that had been damaged or destroyed during Akhenaten's persecution were replaced. The great temples of Amen at Karnak and Luxor were restored to their central position in the religious life of the kingdom. And the new capital at Akhetaten was abandoned, its population moving away to the old established cities of Thebes and Memphis, leaving the site to be gradually buried by the desert and forgotten. But as we explored in Part 1, the ideas of Akhenaten had not been entirely confined to his capital. And the effort required to reverse his revolution, the energy and resources devoted to erasing his name from monuments and restoring the old order, testifies to the depth of the disruption his reign had caused. You do not spend that much effort erasing someone who was entirely without influence. The successors of Tutankhamun, particularly Horemheb and then Ramesses I and the subsequent pharaohs of the 19th dynasty, continued and intensified the process of restoration and renewal, building and rebuilding on a scale that reflected both their genuine piety and their desire to demonstrate unmistakably that Egypt had returned to the correct relationship with its gods and that the aberration of the Amarna period was definitively over. It is in this context that the massive building programs of Seti I and Ramesses II must be understood, not just as expressions of personal ambition, but as ideological statements, proof that Egypt's relationship with its gods was restored, that Ma'at had been re-established, and that the natural order of the universe was once again in good repair. The temples that Ramesses II built or completed are among the most impressive monuments in all of ancient Egypt. The temple complex at Abu Simbel, cut directly into the sandstone cliff of Nubia, in a location that was deep within the territory that Egypt had conquered and was actively working to keep under control, is an architectural tour de force that serves simultaneously as a temple to the gods, a monument to Ramesses' own divine status, and a very emphatic statement to the Nubian population about the power and permanence of Egyptian rule. The 4 colossal seated figures of Ramesses on the facade, each more than 20 meters high, their faces staring eastward with an expression of serene, implacable authority, would have been visible to approaching travelers from a considerable distance, a reminder long before you arrived at the temple of who was in charge and what that meant. The interior of the great temple at Abu Simbel is as remarkable as its exterior. The main sanctuary extends more than 60 meters into the cliff, its walls covered with painted reliefs depicting scenes of battle and religious ceremony, of Ramesses triumphing over his enemies and making offerings to the gods. At the very back of the sanctuary, in a small chamber cut into the deepest part of the cliff, 4 seated figures were carved from the living rock, representations of the gods Ta, Amun-Re, Ramesses himself in his divine aspect, and Re-Horakti. The alignment of the temple was calculated with extraordinary precision, so that twice a year, on dates that may have been associated with Ramesses' birthday and his coronation, the rising sun would penetrate all the way through the 60-meter length of the temple's main axis and illuminate the faces of these 4 figures. Only Ta, the god of the underworld, was positioned so that the sunlight never fully reached his face, even on these special days. This astronomical alignment is one of the most spectacular examples of the sophisticated astronomical knowledge that Egyptian architects and priests possessed and routinely built into their religious structures. The orientation of temples towards specific astronomical events was a widespread practice in ancient Egypt, not a universal rule, but a frequently employed device that connected the human world of the temple to the divine world of the heavens. The rising of the sun, with all its theological significance as the daily resurrection of the god Re, and by extension the daily renewal of the cosmic order, was the most commonly employed orientation, but the rising and setting of specific stars, particularly Sirius and certain stars of Orion, were also used in ways that we are still working to fully understand. The astronomical knowledge encoded in Egyptian monuments and texts is itself a rich field of ongoing research. The Egyptians were careful and accurate observers of the sky, and their astronomical knowledge, developed over thousands of years of observation and recording, was surprisingly sophisticated. Their ability to track the apparent movements of the stars and planets, to predict astronomical events, and to use stellar observations for practical purposes including calendar keeping, tomb orientation, and the timing of religious ceremonies, went considerably beyond what a civilization without telescopes or modern mathematical tools might be expected to achieve. And this brings us to a broader point about the nature of Egyptian knowledge and Egyptian science, a subject that is sometimes underappreciated in popular discussions of the civilization that tend to focus on its monuments and its mysteries while neglecting its intellectual achievements. The ancient Egyptians were not just builders and artists and administrators, though they were all of these things to a remarkable degree. They were also thinkers, observers, and systematizers, people who applied careful attention and accumulated knowledge to a wide range of practical problems and arrived at solutions of genuine sophistication. Egyptian medicine, for example, as documented in surviving medical papyri like the Edwin Smith Papyrus and the Ebers Papyrus, reveals a level of clinical observation and rational analysis that is genuinely impressive. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, which dates to the New Kingdom but may copy older texts from the Old Kingdom period, is a surgical textbook that describes 48 cases of injuries and diseases with a systematic methodology that any modern clinician would recognize. Each case is described in terms of its presentation, the physician's examination, the diagnosis, the treatment, and the expected outcome. The author distinguishes clearly between cases that can be treated and cured, cases that can be treated but the outcome is uncertain, and cases that cannot be treated, a triage approach that reflects genuine clinical wisdom. The Ebers Papyrus, somewhat later in date and broader in scope, covers an enormous range of medical conditions and treatments, from infections and injuries to what appear to be descriptions of conditions like diabetes, cancer, and cardiovascular disease. Many of the treatments described involve herbal remedies and other substances whose effectiveness modern pharmacology can sometimes confirm and sometimes contradict. But the underlying approach, the systematic description of symptoms, the formulation of diagnoses, and the recommendation of specific treatments, reflects a medical tradition of genuine sophistication, one that was accumulating and refining clinical knowledge over many centuries. Egyptian mathematics, similarly, was more advanced than is sometimes appreciated. The Rhine Mathematical Papyrus, a New Kingdom copy of a Middle Kingdom original, shows that Egyptian mathematicians were capable of handling fractions with considerable skill, of solving problems involving areas and volumes, and of performing calculations that would have been required for large-scale engineering projects like pyramid construction. Their mathematical notation was different from ours, and their approach to certain problems was different, but the practical results they achieved were accurate and reliable. You cannot build a pyramid with an error of less than 0.5% in the alignment of its base if your mathematics does not work. The sophistication of Egyptian knowledge in these various domains is relevant to understanding the monuments and the civilization more broadly, because it reminds us that the Egyptians were not mysterious geniuses working by some form of intuition or divine inspiration, as some popular accounts have implied. They were practical, rational, methodical people who accumulated knowledge systematically over many generations and applied it intelligently to the problems they faced. The pyramids are the products of human intelligence and human organization, not of supernatural assistance or lost technology, and that, in many ways, makes them more rather than less impressive. As we continue our journey through the revelations and mysteries of ancient Egypt, We turn now to the broader context of Egypt's place in the ancient world, its relationships with its neighbors and trading partners, the ways in which it both influenced and was influenced by the other great civilizations of the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean. Because Egypt, for all its remarkable internal coherence and its long tradition of cultural self-confidence that sometimes shaded into actual xenophobia, was never truly isolated from the wider world. It was always part of a web of interaction, exchange, and occasionally conflict with the other civilizations of its era. The relationship between ancient Egypt and Nubia, the territory to its south along the Nile that is now divided between southern Egypt and modern Sudan, is one of the most complex and most fascinating in the ancient world. For most of Egyptian history, Nubia was either a dependent territory under Egyptian control, a source of the gold and other resources that Egypt prized so highly, or an independent kingdom that was simultaneously a rival and a trading partner. The nature of the relationship shifted many times over 3,000 years, sometimes the Egyptians expanding southward and bringing Nubia under their direct administration, sometimes withdrawing to a boundary in the north, sometimes existing alongside an independent Nubian kingdom in a relationship of diplomatic contact and commercial exchange. What makes the Egyptian-Nubian relationship particularly fascinating from an archaeological perspective is the degree to which cultural exchange worked in both directions. We tend to think of Egypt as the dominant partner in this relationship, the powerful civilization imposing its culture on a weaker neighbor. And in political and military terms, during the periods of Egyptian control of Nubia, this is largely accurate. The Egyptians built temples in Nubian style at Nubian sites. They introduced Egyptian administrative and religious practices. They encouraged or required Nubian elites to adopt Egyptian cultural forms, but Nubian culture also had profound effects on Egypt. Nubian soldiers served in Egyptian armies and eventually came to occupy senior military positions. Nubian cultural practices and religious beliefs influenced Egyptian culture in ways that can be traced in art, religion, and material culture. Nubian musical traditions, for example, are believed to have had significant influences on Egyptian music, which was an important part of both religious ceremony and entertainment. Nubian cattle breeds contributed to Egyptian cattle herds, and Nubian gold, without which the Egyptian economy would have been significantly poorer, was so central to Egyptian wealth and power that its continued supply was a strategic priority of the highest importance. The period of Nubian domination of Egypt, which occurred during the 25th dynasty, roughly 747 to 656 BCE, when rulers from the Nubian kingdom of Kush conquered Egypt and ruled it as pharaohs, is one of the most fascinating reversals in the long history of the relationship between these two civilizations. The Nubian pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, figures like Shabako, Taharka, and Tanutaman, were not conquerors who imposed a foreign culture. On the contrary, they presented themselves as restorers of Egyptian tradition, champions of the old religious and cultural values that they felt had been allowed to decay under the weaker rulers of the preceding period. Their monuments followed Egyptian conventions. Their religious programs emphasized their devotion to the traditional Egyptian gods, and in many respects their reigns were periods of genuine cultural and religious renewal. The monuments left by the 25th dynasty rulers in both Egypt and Nubia testify to the deep cultural entanglement of these two civilizations by this period, and to the sophisticated way in which the Nubian pharaohs navigated the complex cultural landscape they inhabited. In Nubia itself, the tradition of pyramid building that Egypt had developed during the Old and Middle Kingdoms was revived and continued, with Nubian rulers being buried in steep-sided pyramids at sites like Nuri and Meroe that differ in style from the Egyptian pyramids but draw clearly on the same tradition. These Nubian pyramids, which continued to be built long after pyramid construction had ceased in Egypt itself, represent one of the most remarkable cases of cultural transmission and adaptation in the ancient world. The international connections of Egypt extended far beyond Nubia, of course. The trading relationships that brought cedar from Lebanon, myrrh from Punt, copper from Cyprus, tin from distant eastern sources, and all the other materials that Egypt required have already been mentioned. but the cultural and political relationships that accompanied these trade networks were equally important and equally complex. The Late Bronze Age world, roughly 1550 to 1200 BCE, was an era of remarkable international interconnection among the major civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Egypt, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, Babylon in Mesopotamia, the Kingdom of Mitanni in what is now northern Syria and Iraq, the Mycenaean civilization in Greece and the Aegean, and the various smaller city-states and kingdoms of the Levanten coast were all in regular contact with each other through trade, diplomacy, and occasionally warfare. The diplomatic correspondence of this era, preserved in the form of the Amarna letters, a cache of clay tablets inscribed in the Babylonian cuneiform writing that served as the diplomatic lingua franca of the period, gives us an extraordinary window into the relationships between these civilizations at the level of the highest political communication. The Amarna letters found at the site of Akhenaten's capital in the late 19th century include letters between Akhenaten and the rulers of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, the Hittites, and various Levanten city-states. They reveal a world of sophisticated diplomacy, of carefully calibrated exchanges of gifts and messages, of marriage alliances and trade agreements, and occasional expressions of genuine frustration when agreements were not honored or expectations were not met. The language of these letters is often remarkably frank, with foreign rulers occasionally complaining about the inadequacy of Egyptian gifts or the delay in Egyptian responses to their messages. Reading them, you get a vivid sense of the personalities involved and of the complex web of obligations and expectations that governed international relations in this period. Egypt's position in this late Bronze Age international system was one of enormous wealth and prestige. Egyptian gold was the currency of international relations, and requests for gold dominate the diplomatic correspondence from every other court in the region. The kings of Babylon and Mitanni and Assyria wrote to the Egyptian pharaoh in terms that acknowledged his superiority, while simultaneously pressing their requests for the gold and luxury goods that only Egypt could provide in the quantities they desired. The Egyptian pharaoh, for his part, played the role of the great gift-giver, dispensing patronage across the region and cementing diplomatic relationships through the distribution of luxury goods alongside the formal diplomatic exchanges. The collapse of this late Bronze Age international system, which occurred around 1200 BCE with remarkable rapidity and thoroughness, destroying or severely disrupting every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean region, is one of the most dramatic events in ancient history and one of the most actively debated among modern scholars. Egypt survived, though in a diminished and significantly changed form, while the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean civilization, and many of the Levanten city-states were destroyed or abandoned. The cause or causes of this collapse remain controversial, with proposed explanations including the invasions of the so-called Sea Peoples, climate change and drought leading to famine, internal social and economic disruption, and various combinations of these factors. For Egypt, the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse was a long period of gradual weakening, as the political stability and international commercial connections that had sustained the new kingdom were disrupted or destroyed. The 20th dynasty, the last dynasty of the new kingdom, saw Egypt struggling with economic difficulties, labor unrest, tomb robberies, and the growing power of the priesthood of Amun relative to the royal family, a situation that eventually led to the fragmentation of the country into effectively two separate political units, the pharaoh ruling from the north and the high priests of Amun ruling from Thebes in the south. But even in this period of relative weakness, the cultural vitality of Egyptian civilization remained remarkable. The literary productions of the Ramesside period, the love poetry mentioned earlier, the satirical papyri that poke fun at Egyptian social conventions, the great religious and mythological texts that were being compiled and refined in the temples and scriptoria of Thebes, testify to a civilization still capable of extraordinary intellectual and artistic achievement even as its political structures were under strain. The creativity of a civilization is not always directly correlated with its political power, and Egypt in the centuries following the Bronze Age collapse produced some of its most distinctive and most fascinating cultural expressions precisely during the periods when its political situation was most difficult. The Third Intermediate Period and the late period that followed it, covering roughly 1,000 years from around 1069 to 332 BCE, are periods that receive considerably less popular attention than the dramatic peaks of the Old Kingdom and the New Kingdom, but that are in many ways just as interesting and just as productive of remarkable archaeological discoveries. It was during the late period, as already noted, that many of the elaborately painted wooden coffins being discovered at Saqqara were produced. It was also during this period that some of the most spectacular temple construction in Egypt's history took place, as successive rulers sought to express their legitimacy and their piety through architectural patronage on a grand scale. The temples of the Ptolemaic period, built after Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt and the establishment of the Greek Macedonian Ptolemaic dynasty, are among the best preserved in all of Egypt, partly because they are the most recent of the major temple complexes, and partly because the political and religious priorities of the Ptolemaic rulers led them to invest heavily in temple construction, as a way of legitimizing their rule in the eyes of the Egyptian population. Temples at Edfu, Dendera, Kam Ambo, Philae, and Esna, built largely between 330 BCE, give us an extraordinarily complete picture of what Egyptian temples looked like and how they functioned in their final phase of active use. The Temple of Horus at Edfu, dedicated to the falcon-headed god Horus, and built over a period of approximately 180 years between 237 and 57 BCE, is one of the most completely preserved ancient temples anywhere in the world. Its outer walls, towers, and hypostyle hall are essentially intact, their surfaces covered with reliefs and texts that provide an encyclopedic record of Egyptian religion and ritual practice in this period. Walking through the temple, from the towering pylon entrance with its reliefs of the pharaoh smiting enemies before the gods, through the outer and inner hypostyle halls with their forests of carved and painted columns, past the various subsidiary chapels and offering halls, to the innermost sanctuary where the cult statue of the god was kept in absolute darkness and accessed only by the highest-ranking priests, you experience something of what an Egyptian temple actually was as a functioning religious institution. Not just a monument, not just a tourist attraction, but a machine for maintaining the relationship between the human and the divine. The religious texts inscribed on the walls of temples like Edfu are invaluable resources for understanding Egyptian theology in its most developed and sophisticated form. By the Ptolemaic period, Egyptian religious thought had been accumulating and developing for more than 3,000 years, and the texts that were being carved on temple walls at this time represented the distillation of this enormous tradition, complex and multi-layered in ways that scholars are still working to fully analyze and understand. The mysteries of Osiris, the central myth of Egyptian religion, the story of the god's death at the hands of his brother Set, his resurrection by his wife Isis, and the avenging of his death by his son Horus, were elaborated in the Ptolemaic temples with a detail and a theological sophistication that goes far beyond anything in earlier texts. The rituals associated with these myths, the ceremonies performed daily, monthly, and annually in the temple to maintain and renew the divine order, are described with a specificity that allows modern scholars to reconstruct in considerable detail what actually happened in these sacred spaces and what it meant to the people who participated in or witnessed these ceremonies. The question of what ordinary Egyptians believed and how they practiced their religion, as opposed to the elaborate state religion of the temples and the mortuary cult of the royal family, is one that has received increasing scholarly attention in recent decades, and the answers emerging from archaeological and textual evidence are both rich and sometimes surprising. Egyptian religion was not a monolithic system imposed from above, with ordinary people passively accepting whatever the state and the temple establishment told them to believe. It was a living, diverse, sometimes contentious set of practices and beliefs that varied by region, by period, by social class, and by individual inclination. At the popular level, Egyptian religious life was full of practices that the formal temple religion barely acknowledged. Magic, for example, was absolutely central to the religious lives of ordinary Egyptians in a way that the formal theological literature sometimes obscures. Magical texts and magical objects, amulets, figurines, ostraca inscribed with spells, have been found in enormous quantities at domestic sites and village settlements across Egypt, testifying to a rich tradition of popular magic that was used for healing, for protection against evil forces and hostile neighbors, for success in love and business, and for a wide range of other practical purposes. The practitioners of this magic were not necessarily the same as the priests of the formal temple cult. They might be local specialists, sometimes called doctors or healers, who combined medical treatment with magical practice in a way that reflects the Egyptian understanding of illness as having both physical and supernatural dimensions. The oracles of various gods were another important element of popular religious practice. The major gods, particularly Amen at Thebes, were believed to communicate their will directly in response to questions put to them during festival processions. When the god's statue was carried in its sacred bark along a processional route and would indicate yes or no answers to questions by the movement of the bark. Evidence for this practice is found both in the texts that describe it and in the physical remains of the processional routes, with their carefully constructed paved paths and the stations where the bark would stop for specific ceremonies. The oracle of Amen at Thebes was consulted on a wide range of matters, from questions of inheritance and land ownership to accusations of theft and murder, and its decisions had genuine legal force in the community. The sacred animals of Egypt, those specific species that were regarded as manifestations of particular deities, and that were kept in temples, bred in special facilities, and eventually mummified and offered as votive gifts, represent another dimension of popular religious practice that is being revealed with increasing clarity by ongoing archaeological research. The sheer scale of animal mummification in ancient Egypt, which was operating on an almost industrial scale during the late period, is staggering. Millions, literally millions, of mummified animals, cats sacred to the goddess Bastet, ibises sacred to Thoth, falcons sacred to Horus, crocodiles sacred to Sobek, bulls, dogs, baboons, and many other species, were produced, deposited in vast underground galleries at sacred sites, and eventually forgotten. These galleries are still being discovered and excavated, and the animal mummies they contain are providing important information about ancient Egyptian ecology, animal husbandry practices, and the economics of religious devotion. The cat cemeteries at Bubastes, the ibis galleries at Hermopolis, the crocodile mummies at Kam Ambo, these sites testify to a popular religiosity that was both deeply felt and thoroughly organized, combining genuine piety with what appears to have been a well-organized commercial system for providing votive offerings to pilgrims. Recent analysis of the animal mummies themselves has revealed some interesting and somewhat uncomfortable findings, specifically that a significant proportion of the mummified animals in these collections were young or even infant animals, suggesting that the production of animal mummies was not just about preserving sacred animals that died naturally, but involved the deliberate breeding and killing of large numbers of animals specifically to meet the demand for votive offerings. This gives us an important economic dimension to popular religious practice, a system in which the demand of pilgrims for offerings to bring to the gods created a supply industry of considerable scale. The exploration of ancient Egypt's relationship with its own landscape, its use and transformation of the natural environment, has already led us to remarkable discoveries in the Sinai and along the Nile. But there are further dimensions of this relationship that deserve attention, because the ancient Egyptians were, in ways that are only recently becoming fully appreciated, sophisticated environmental managers whose manipulation of the landscape had profound effects on both the ecology and the long-term habitability of the regions they occupied. The most obvious example of Egyptian environmental engineering is the management of the Nile's annual flood. The flood was the foundation of Egyptian agriculture, but it was also a potential threat. Too little flooding in the fields would not receive sufficient water and nutrients for a good harvest. Too much flooding and the floodwaters would stay high for too long, destroying crops and damaging settlements. The Egyptians developed systems of basin irrigation that allowed them to manage and control the floodwaters to a significant degree, directing water into carefully designed basins where it could be retained for the optimal period before draining, and distributing water across the cultivable land more evenly than the natural flood would have done. These irrigation systems required ongoing maintenance and collective management on a scale that was itself a driver of social organization. The need to coordinate the construction and maintenance of dikes and canals, to manage the distribution of water among many users, and to make collective decisions about when to open and close water management structures was one of the forces that pushed Egyptian society toward the highly organized, centrally administered form that we associate with the civilization at its height. The Nile, in other words, was not just a physical resource. It was a social force, shaping the organization of Egyptian society in fundamental ways. Beyond the flood management systems, the Egyptians also undertook other forms of landscape modification that are now being revealed by a combination of traditional archaeology and remote sensing technology. Satellite imagery, processed in ways that reveal features not visible to the naked eye, has been revealing the traces of ancient field systems, canal networks, settlement patterns, and other features of the ancient agricultural landscape that have been invisible at ground level but are showing up clearly from above. In the Nile Delta, where the flat, waterlogged landscape has preserved organic remains exceptionally well, while simultaneously hiding structural remains beneath later deposits, satellite imagery has revealed the outlines of ancient settlements, harbors, and canal systems that are completely invisible at ground level. The Delta is perhaps the most archaeologically neglected major region of Egypt, partly because of the preservation challenges already mentioned, partly because the modern population density of the Delta is high and much of the ancient landscape is now buried under modern agriculture and habitation, and partly because the richest and most dramatic monuments of ancient Egypt are concentrated in Upper Egypt, the southern part of the country. Drawing most of the attention and most of the resources of archaeological investigation. But the Delta was, for significant periods of Egyptian history, one of the most important regions of the country. The Hyksos, the foreign dynasty that ruled northern Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period, and whose expulsion provided the founding narrative for the new kingdom, were based in the Delta. The great trading city of Pi-Ramesses, which Ramesses II built as his new capital in the northeastern Delta, and which some scholars have connected with the biblical city of Ramses, was one of the largest cities in the ancient world during his reign. And throughout Egyptian history, the Delta was the interface between Egypt and the Mediterranean world, the place where Egyptians and foreigners met and traded and sometimes fought. The recent discovery and exploration of the sunken city of Thonis Heracleion, once one of the great ports of ancient Egypt, lying beneath the waters of Aboukir Bay near Alexandria, has been one of the most spectacular underwater archaeological discoveries in the world. The city, which served as Egypt's main port of entry for trade from the Greek world during the later periods of Egyptian history, sank beneath the sea due to a combination of rising sea levels and land subsidence sometime after the fall of the Roman Empire. Preserved by the cold, dark waters of the bay for more than 1,000 years, it has yielded extraordinary treasures to underwater excavation, including massive stone statues of gods and pharaohs, bronze ritual objects, gold jewelry, and enormous quantities of pottery and other everyday objects. The sunken streets and building foundations of the city, visible to divers on the sandy seabed, give an almost uncanny impression of a place that has simply been dropped beneath the waves and preserved intact, waiting to be rediscovered. The treasures emerging from Thonis Heracleion and from related sunken sites in the same bay are transforming our understanding of the last centuries of independent Egypt, the period from roughly 600 BCE until the Roman conquest in 30 BCE, when Egypt was navigating a complex world of competing powers, maintaining its cultural distinctiveness while engaging with and sometimes being dominated by the great empires of the Near East and the Mediterranean. The objects from the sunken city include stunning examples of the artistic and religious traditions of this late period, showing how Egyptian art continued to evolve and develop right up to the end of the pharaonic era while maintaining its distinctive character and its connection to the traditions of the past. The end of pharaonic Egypt, the moment when the 3,000-year tradition of rule by indigenous Egyptian kings gave way to the dominance of foreign powers, is usually dated to 332 BCE and the conquest of Alexander the Great. But the reality is more complex than this simple date suggests. Egypt had already been conquered and ruled by foreign powers before Alexander arrived. The Persian Empire had conquered Egypt in 525 BCE, and Egyptian kings had regained independence for various periods between the first Persian conquest and Alexander's arrival. The relationship between Egypt and the wider Mediterranean world was already changing fundamentally in the centuries before Alexander, as Greek traders and mercenaries settled in Egypt in increasing numbers, and as the intellectual and cultural traditions of Greece and Egypt began to interact and influence each other in ways that would eventually produce the remarkable synthesis of Ptolemaic culture. When Alexander arrived in Egypt in 332 BCE, the Egyptians received him not as a conqueror but as a liberator, at least according to the sources available to us, because he was freeing them from Persian rule, which had been deeply unpopular. Alexander paid his respects to the Egyptian gods, was formally crowned as pharaoh in the traditional manner, and made the extraordinary journey across the western desert to the oracle of Amun at Siwa, where, according to tradition, he was declared the son of Amun, thereby acquiring the divine legitimacy that Egyptian kingship required. It was a brilliant piece of political theater, and Alexander played it perfectly. The Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander's death until the death of Cleopatra VII in 30 BCE was, in formal terms, a Greek Macedonian dynasty that spoke Greek, had Greek cultural references and aesthetic preferences, and was embedded in the Greek world of the Eastern Mediterranean. But the Ptolemaic rulers also understood, as Alexander had understood before them, that in Egypt you governed as pharaoh or you did not govern at all. The religious and cultural architecture of Egyptian civilization was too deeply embedded, too thoroughly part of how Egyptians understood their world and their place in it, to be simply set aside. So the Ptolemaic rulers became pharaohs, commissioning temples in the traditional Egyptian style, depicted in Egyptian art in the traditional manner, worshipping the Egyptian gods and supporting the Egyptian temple system with patronage of enormous generosity. Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemaic rulers, is perhaps the most famous person from the ancient world, her story known in every culture and every era since her own time. The historical reality of Cleopatra is considerably more interesting than the simplified romantic narrative that popular culture has constructed around her. She was a woman of formidable intellect, reportedly the first of the Ptolemaic rulers to bother learning the Egyptian language, and the ruler who more than any of her predecessors genuinely engaged with Egyptian culture rather than simply performing pharaonic identity as a political necessity. She spoke multiple languages, was deeply versed in Egyptian religion and its traditions, and navigated the extraordinarily complex political situation of her era, the dying days of the Ptolemaic kingdom squeezed between the competing power centers of the Roman Republic, with a strategic intelligence that commanded the respect even of the Roman commanders who were simultaneously her lovers and her political masters. Her death in 30 BCE, which ended the Ptolemaic dynasty and made Egypt a Roman province, is often presented as the end of ancient Egypt, the moment when the 3,000-year tradition of pharaonic civilization finally came to an end. But this framing is somewhat misleading. Egyptian culture and Egyptian religion continued to exist under Roman rule, and the temples continued to function for several more centuries. The last datable hieroglyphic inscription was made at the Temple of Philae in 394 CE, more than 400 years after Cleopatra's death. The Egyptian language continued to be spoken and written in its Coptic form through the Islamic period and in the context of Egyptian Christian religious practice to the present day. And the mummification of the dead continued in some parts of Egypt well into the Roman period, producing what are called fayum mummy portraits, realistic painted panels placed over the faces of mummies that represent some of the most extraordinary examples of portraiture from the ancient world. The continuity of Egyptian culture across these transitions, its ability to absorb conquest and political change while maintaining its fundamental character, is one of the most remarkable things about it. The same gods who were worshipped in the temples of the Old Kingdom were still being worshipped in the Roman period temples, though their forms and the ways they were understood had evolved considerably over the intervening 3,000 years. The same fundamental ideas about the importance of the afterlife, the need to maintain the body for the soul's return, the significance of the annual Nile flood, the divine authority of the ruler, these things persisted through changes of dynasty and language and political allegiance, in ways that testify to how deeply they were embedded in Egyptian culture, and in the Egyptian understanding of what it meant to be human in the world. As we approach the final movement of our journey through the secrets and discoveries of ancient Egypt, it is worth stepping back for a moment and asking what all of these discoveries, taken together, are telling us. What is the cumulative picture that emerges from the Valley Temple with its ancient calendar, from the unknown chambers beneath the Great Pyramid, from the statues of Hatshepsut reclaimed from their pit of deliberate destruction, from the tree-lined boulevard in the Sinai desert, from the wine jug connecting the Amarna Revolution to a city near Alexandria, from the mummies and their extraordinary scientific revelations, from the sunken city beneath the waters of Aboukir Bay? The picture that emerges is of a civilization of extraordinary complexity, depth, and humanity. A civilization that built for eternity and often achieved it. A civilization that thought deeply about the biggest questions, about the nature of the divine, about the purpose of human existence, about what happens after death, and arrived at answers that were sophisticated, nuanced, and often beautiful. A civilization that organized itself with remarkable efficiency to accomplish enormous collective tasks, from the building of pyramids to the management of flood irrigation to the maintenance of international trade networks spanning thousands of miles. A civilization that included within itself enormous variety, from the royal courts of Thebes and Memphis to the small farming villages along the Nile's banks, from the sophisticated theological speculations of temple scholars to the practical magic of village healers, from the elaborate mortuary preparations of wealthy officials to the simple graves of ordinary people who were buried with whatever a loving family could provide. It was also a civilization with its dark sides, as every human civilization has. It practiced slavery, or at least various forms of forced labor that amount to the same thing. It could be extraordinarily brutal in its treatment of conquered populations. Its social hierarchy was steep and largely immutable, with the vast majority of its population condemned to lives of agricultural labor in support of the elite who consumed the products of that labor. Its political system was, by any modern standard, a form of absolute theocratic monarchy that concentrated power and wealth in the hands of the few to a degree that would be recognized as profoundly unjust by any contemporary standard of human rights and dignity. But human civilizations are always complex, always contradictory, always capable of both beauty and cruelty, of both great achievement and great failure. To condemn ancient Egypt for not being a liberal democracy is as absurd as condemning it for not having internet access. What matters is what it was and what it achieved within its own historical context, and within that context, what ancient Egypt achieved was extraordinary by any measure. It created a tradition of monumental architecture that has not been surpassed in durability, and that has barely been matched in scale. It developed a writing system of remarkable expressiveness and flexibility that was used for everything from the most elevated religious and literary texts to the most mundane administrative records and personal messages. It produced art of breathtaking beauty and sophistication, from the intimate naturalism of Amarna period reliefs to the serene formal grandeur of Old Kingdom royal portraiture to the exuberant narrative energy of New Kingdom battle scenes. It accumulated and systematized knowledge in medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and other fields in ways that laid foundations on which later civilizations, particularly the Greeks, would build. And it maintained its fundamental cultural coherence across more than 3,000 years of history, surviving invasions, internal conflicts, environmental changes, and the rise and fall of dozens of ruling dynasties while remaining recognizably and essentially Egyptian. That durability, that extraordinary persistence of cultural identity across such a vast span of time, is perhaps the most remarkable thing about ancient Egypt, and it is something that the ongoing discoveries of modern archaeology are helping us to understand more fully. Every new tomb excavated at Saqqara, every new scan of the Giza Plateau, every new chemical analysis of a mummy or a mummification workshop, Every new reading of a previously undeciphered or misunderstood text adds to our understanding of how this civilization managed to be what it was for as long as it was. And the picture that emerges is of a civilization that found, in its fundamental beliefs and values and practices, a kind of stability and coherence that was strong enough to weather enormous change without losing its essential character. The concept of Ma'at, that cosmic order which it was the pharaoh's duty to maintain, may be the key. By grounding its entire social and political and religious system in the idea of a natural, cosmic order that was given and not constructed, that was discovered and not invented, Egyptian civilization gave itself an anchor against which the storms of history could beat without fundamentally dislodging it. When catastrophe struck, when a dynasty fell or a foreign power conquered or a famine devastated the population, the appropriate response within the Egyptian framework was not to question the fundamental assumptions of the civilization, but to return to proper practice, to restore Ma'at, to find the right pharaoh and the right rituals and the right relationship with the gods, and thereby re-establish the proper order of things. This framework was enormously powerful precisely because it was self-reinforcing. Every successful recovery from adversity confirmed that the framework worked, that restoring Ma'at did indeed restore stability and prosperity, and this confirmation made the framework more authoritative for the next time adversity struck. The most recent discoveries in Egypt, the discoveries that are still being made, still being analyzed, still being argued about in the journals and conference rooms of Egyptology, are pointing toward a future of even more remarkable revelations. The technology available to modern archaeology is advancing at a pace that would have seemed like science fiction to the generation of scholars who worked in Egypt in the early 20th century. Ground-penetrating radar is improving in resolution and depth of penetration. Satellite imagery is revealing features invisible to any previous generation of researchers. Chemical analysis techniques are becoming more sensitive and more specific. Genetic analysis tools are becoming more capable of extracting and interpreting information from ancient and degraded DNA. And the computational tools for processing and analyzing the enormous quantities of data generated by all of these techniques are becoming more powerful year by year. The combination of these advancing technologies with the still largely unexplored depths of the Egyptian archaeological record is a recipe for continuing discovery of the most exciting kind. We have explored in total only a fraction of the sites that the historical and geographical evidence suggests are present in Egypt. Many major sites remain either completely unexcavated or only partially explored. The sands of the Western Desert conceal sites that have never been identified. The Nile Delta, with its preservation challenges and its high modern population density, conceals a landscape of ancient settlement that has barely been touched. Even the most famous and most intensively studied sites, Giza and Saqqara and Karnak in the Valley of the Kings, still have secrets waiting to be uncovered. The unknown void inside the Great Pyramid is perhaps the most tantalizing example of a secret that is known to exist but has not yet been revealed. The technology that discovered it, muon tomography, is being refined and improved. Robotic and minimally invasive exploration technologies are being developed that might allow researchers to look inside the void without damaging the pyramid. And other unknown spaces, revealed by ground-penetrating radar surveys and other scanning techniques, await investigation across the plateau and across Egypt more broadly. The science of mummification continues to advance with every new mummy examined using the latest analytical techniques. The chemical composition of mummification materials, the genetic information encoded in mummy tissue, the detailed medical history written in the bones and organs of individual mummies, all of this is a resource that becomes more legible with every advance in analytical technology. We are only beginning to understand what the millions of mummies preserved in Egypt's dry desert environment can tell us about the biological and medical history of the ancient Egyptian population, and what they reveal will be relevant not just to understanding ancient Egypt, but to understanding human health and disease in a much broader sense. The sunken cities and harbors of Egypt's Mediterranean coast and the Nile Delta are another frontier of extraordinary potential. Underwater archaeology has transformed our understanding of ancient Mediterranean trade and culture over the past several decades, and the waters around Egypt are particularly rich in preserved ancient sites. The ongoing excavation of Thonis Heraclean and related sites is producing a steady stream of extraordinary finds, and similar sites almost certainly exist at other locations along the Egyptian coast that have not yet been identified and explored. And somewhere in the desert, perhaps, there are discoveries waiting to be made that will be as transformative and as unexpected as any in the history of Egyptian archaeology. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799, which made it possible to decipher hieroglyphics and thereby unlock the written record of the entire civilization. The discovery of the Amarna letters in 1887, which revealed the extraordinary international world of the late Bronze Age. The discovery of the Deir el-Bahari cache in 1881, which brought the mummies of dozens of royal pharaohs back from the shadows of history. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, which gave the world its most vivid and most immediate experience of the richness of ancient Egyptian royal material culture. Each of these discoveries transformed our understanding not just of specific historical questions, but of the civilization as a whole, revealing depths and dimensions that had previously been entirely unknown. And there is every reason to believe that discoveries of similar transformative power are waiting to be made. The people who will make those discoveries are working right now, somewhere in Egypt. They are crouching in the heat, brushing sand from stone surfaces. They are processing radar data in their offices, staring at screens where anomalous reflections hint at structures that nobody has seen in thousands of years. They are analyzing chemical data in their laboratories, identifying organic compounds that tell the story of how an ancient craftsman prepared a body for eternity. They are reading texts in ancient scripts, making sense of words that have not been read since the civilization that produced them passed from the world. They are, in their own way, doing what every generation of archaeologists has done since the first systematic investigations of ancient Egypt began, pressing deeper into the mystery, adding new knowledge to the accumulated understanding of humanity, refusing to accept the limitations of what is already known and pressing always for more. This is one of the most admirable things about archaeology as a human enterprise. It is patient, methodical, collaborative work, rarely glamorous, often literally dirty, sometimes frustrating in ways that would defeat less committed personalities. But it is driven by a passion for knowledge, by a genuine love of the past and the people who inhabited it, and by the conviction that understanding where we came from and what other human beings have made of their time on Earth is not a luxury or an entertainment but a necessity, something fundamental to our understanding of ourselves and our possibilities. Ancient Egypt is one of the great chapters of that larger human story. Not the only great chapter, not even necessarily the greatest, but one of the most extraordinary, most enduring, and most richly documented. The three-dimensional complexity that modern archaeology is revealing, the dynamic, evolving, internally diverse, internationally connected civilization that is emerging from beneath the simplified image of pyramids and mummies and mysteries, is a gift to everyone who cares about human history and human achievement. And it is a gift that is still being unwrapped. The sands of Egypt are still giving up their secrets. The desert still holds more than it has yet shown us. And every day, somewhere on or beneath the ancient landscape of the Nile Valley and the Delta and the deserts that flank them, something new is being discovered, something that adds another piece to the great puzzle of understanding what this extraordinary civilization truly was. As our journey through the secrets and discoveries of ancient Egypt draws toward its close, it is worth pausing to consider not just what we have learned, but what it feels like to know these things. Because the impact of these discoveries is not purely intellectual. It is emotional, even spiritual, in the sense of touching something deep in the human experience of being alive and being mortal and being part of a species with a long, rich, complicated history on this earth. When we look at the face of a mummy that has been preserved by ancient craft and desert dryness for 3,000 years, we are looking at someone who was once alive, who breathed and thought and felt and loved and feared and hoped, someone whose experience of being human was in its fundamentals not so different from our own. The painted portraits on the Fayum mummies, those extraordinary Romano-Egyptian panels that stare back at us across 2 millennia with eyes that seem full of presence and personality, are perhaps the most direct and most affecting expression of this. These are faces of real individuals, people whose names and histories we sometimes know and sometimes do not, but whose humanity is unmistakable and immediate in a way that more formal ancient portraiture rarely achieves. The love poetry of the New Kingdom, written on papyrus scrolls in a language that died as a spoken tongue more than 1,000 years ago, speaks with a voice that is entirely recognizable. Your love has gone all through my body, one ancient Egyptian poet writes, like honey into water, like a drug mixed into spices, like water mingled with wine. The person who wrote those words was living in a world profoundly different from ours in almost every practical respect. But the experience they were describing, the way love feels when it takes hold of you completely and suffuses your whole being, that experience is the same now as it was then, the same for us as it was for them. This is what the study of ancient Egypt ultimately gives us, beyond the pleasure of magnificent monuments and the intellectual excitement of unsolved mysteries. It gives us a mirror in which we can see our own humanity reflected back at us across an enormous gulf of time. It tells us that the things that matter to us, the desire to leave something lasting, to be remembered, to love and be loved, to make sense of the universe and our place in it, to face the unknown with courage and creativity, these things are not recent inventions or culturally specific preferences. They are ancient constants, as old as civilization itself and probably older. The ancient Egyptians faced the great questions of human existence, the questions of death and meaning and divinity and the proper organization of society, with a seriousness and a creativity and a sheer ambition of response that is still extraordinary to contemplate. They built pyramids to last forever, and they have lasted for 4,500 years and counting. They wrote texts to guide their dead safely through the underworld, and those texts are still being read and studied and pondered today. They painted their tombs with images of a good life well lived, of harvests and feasts and music and family, and those images still have the power to move us, still speak across the millennia of a human hunger for beauty and joy and the ordinary pleasures of existence. They were not perfect, no civilization is, no human beings are, but they were, in the fullest and most complete sense of the word, human. And that is what the desert is revealing, one discovery at a time, one grain of sand shifted by the archaeologist's brush at a time. Not just monuments, not just mysteries, but people vivid and real and present, speaking to us from the deep past in the only language that truly transcends time, the language of our shared humanity. The Nile still flows, the desert still stretches, vast and patient in every direction. The pyramids still stand against the sky, as they have stood for 45 centuries, outlasting every empire and every ideology and every attempt to comprehend them fully. Beneath the sand, the secrets wait, and the people who seek them, the archaeologists and scientists and scholars with their brushes and their scanners and their unquenchable curiosity, press on, because the story of ancient Egypt is not finished. It will never be finished, and that perhaps is the most remarkable thing of all. The journey we have taken together through the world of ancient Egypt, from the royal ships on the Nile to the unknown chambers beneath the pyramids, from the temples of Hatshepsut to the sunken cities of the Mediterranean coast, from the mummification workshops of Saqqara to the radical revolution of Akhenaten and the Atenist wine jug found far from its expected home, has been a journey through one of the greatest chapters in the long story of human civilization. We have seen how modern technology is transforming our understanding of a civilization that has been studied for centuries, revealing depths and complexities and individual human stories that previous generations of scholars could only glimpse or imagine. We have seen how every new discovery raises new questions, how every answered mystery reveals new ones lurking beneath it, and how the process of discovery is itself one of the most fundamentally human things we do. Ancient Egypt, in the end, is not just about the past. It is about the present and the future as well. It is about what human beings are capable of when they apply their intelligence and their creativity and their organizational abilities to ambitious goals. It is about the enduring power of belief, of art, of the human refusal to accept that anything is impossible. It is about the way in which cultures can persist and evolve and adapt over extraordinary spans of time while maintaining their fundamental character. And it is about the way in which the past is never truly past, never truly finished with us, always reaching forward through the artifacts it leaves behind and the questions those artifacts raise, touching us in the present with its reality and its beauty and its enduring fascination. The sands of Egypt hold more secrets than they have yet given up. The desert is patient, the civilization it conceals was magnificent, and the story it has to tell, to those willing to listen, to those willing to brush away the sand and look carefully at what lies beneath, is one of the greatest stories the human race has ever lived. It is a story still being told, and we are still listening. There is a land where the sun burns so fiercely that the very air seems to shimmer and dissolve at the edges of vision. A land where rivers of gold-colored sand stretch endlessly toward horizons that feel like the boundaries of the world itself. A land where, if you press your ear close enough to the ancient stone, you might almost hear the whisper of a civilization so magnificent, so breathtakingly complex, that even after thousands of years of excavation, scholarship, and discovery, we have barely scratched the surface of what it truly was. That land is Egypt, and the story it has to tell is unlike anything else in the long and turbulent history of human existence on this planet. For centuries, explorers, treasure hunters, scholars, and dreamers have been drawn to Egypt like moths to a flame. They came looking for gold, for glory, for knowledge, for proof of things they had only dared to imagine. Some found riches beyond their wildest expectations. Others found only questions, mysteries so deep and so layered that answering one seemed only to reveal three more lurking beneath it. And today, armed with technologies that those early explorers could never have conceived of, ground-penetrating radar, satellite imaging, three-dimensional scanning, chemical analysis, genetic sequencing, modern archaeologists are making discoveries that are forcing us to completely rethink everything we thought we knew about this ancient world. What you are about to hear is not a simple retelling of a well-worn story. This is not the Egypt of textbooks that have sat unchanged on classroom shelves for decades. This is a living, breathing Egypt, a civilization that is still revealing itself to us, still surprising us, still humbling us with the sheer scale and sophistication of what its people achieved. Over the course of this documentary, we are going to travel deep into the heart of that civilization. We are going to stand at the edge of the Nile, that great artery of life without which none of this would have been possible, and we are going to watch as it reveals its secrets one by one. We are going to descend beneath the Giza Plateau and peer into chambers that no human eye has seen in thousands of years. We are going to sit in the shadow of temples built by a woman who dared to do what no woman before her had done, who seized the most powerful throne in the ancient world and held it with grace, intelligence, and an iron will. We are going to cross the burning Sinai desert and find, to our astonishment, that it was not always the desolate wasteland it appears to be today. And we are going to follow the trail of a radical pharaoh whose ideas were so explosive, so fundamentally threatening to the established order, that his own successors tried to erase him from history entirely. This is the story of ancient Egypt as it has never quite been told before. This is a story being written right now, in real time, by men and women crouching in the desert with brushes and scanners and a burning hunger to know. So settle in, because what follows is more than 2,000 years of mystery, majesty, and breathtaking human achievement. And it begins, as almost everything in Egypt begins, with the river. The Nile is not simply a river. To describe it that way would be like describing the sun as simply a star, technically accurate but so reductive as to be almost meaningless. The Nile is the reason Egypt exists. It is the reason that in the middle of one of the most unforgiving deserts on the face of the earth, a civilization of extraordinary sophistication and longevity was able to take root, to grow, to flourish for more than 3,000 years in a way that no other ancient civilization managed to replicate. Without the Nile, there is no Egypt. Without the Nile, there are no pyramids, no temples, no hieroglyphs, no mummies, no pharaohs. There is only sand and silence and the merciless sun beating down on a landscape empty of everything except its own brutal beauty. The ancient Egyptians understood this with a clarity that was almost religious, because for them it was religious. The Nile was not just a geographical feature. It was a divine gift, a manifestation of the gods' favor toward the Egyptian people and the Egyptian land. They called it Itru, simply the river, because there was no other river worth naming by comparison. Every year, with a predictability that felt like a miracle repeated endlessly, the Nile would flood its banks, spreading across the surrounding land and depositing a rich, dark layer of silt that made the soil extraordinarily fertile. This flooding was so central to Egyptian life that they named it after the god Hapi, a deity depicted as a blue or green figure with the body of a heavy-set man, symbolizing abundance and the bringing of life. The flooding season was called Akhit, and when the waters receded, they left behind a black, nourishing earth that the Egyptians called Kemet, the Black Land, which was also one of the names they used for their own country. Everything beyond the reach of the flood, the endless yellow and red desert, was Deseret, the Red Land, the place of death and demons. This simple geographical division between the Black Land and the Red Land shaped everything about how ancient Egyptians saw the world. Life and civilization existed in the narrow green strip along the Nile's banks. Death and chaos existed everywhere else, and at the very center of this geography, moving ceaselessly from the heart of Africa northward to the great delta where it emptied into the Mediterranean Sea, the river carried not just water and silt and life, but something else. It carried people, it carried goods, it carried ideas. It carried the pharaoh himself, traveling in a manner befitting someone who was considered not just a ruler, but a living god on earth. And this is where one of our most fascinating recent discoveries begins, because archaeologists working along the Nile have been uncovering evidence that the royal use of the river was far more elaborate, far more theatrical, and far more politically sophisticated than anyone previously imagined. Recent excavations and artifact analyses have revealed evidence of royal vessels of remarkable luxury, ships that were not merely functional transport but floating palaces, elaborate statements of power and divine status designed to awe everyone who saw them as they glided downstream on the gleaming waters of the Nile. Imagine standing on the bank of the Nile 4,000 years ago, perhaps as a farmer tending to your fields or a merchant unloading goods at a small riverside settlement. The air smells of mud and green things growing, the smell that meant survival, that meant another year of abundance rather than hunger. The sun is already climbing, beginning its daily journey across a sky so intensely blue it seems almost artificial. And then you see it coming, moving against the current with the steady rhythm of dozens of oars, or perhaps drifting with the current aided by a great sail billowing in the desert wind. A ship, but not just any ship. A vessel that seems to belong to another world entirely, its hull gleaming with polished cedar wood imported at enormous expense from the forests of what is now Lebanon, its prow and stern curving upward in graceful arcs decorated with gilded wood and painted imagery of the gods. On the deck, sheltered beneath canopies of the finest linen that diffused the brutal Egyptian sunlight into something soft and golden, figures moved in the manner of those who understood perfectly that they were always being watched, always performing their divine role for the benefit of the watching world. The pharaoh's river journeys were not simply travel from one place to another. They were processional events, carefully choreographed displays of power that reminded everyone who saw them that Egypt's ruler was not merely human. The royal fleet would include not just the pharaoh's own vessel, but a flotilla of accompanying ships carrying officials, priests, soldiers, servants, provisions, and the endless apparatus of royal administration. When the fleet arrived at a settlement, the arrival itself was a kind of ceremony, a moment charged with religious significance and political meaning. The pharaoh, stepping from the divine space of the royal ship onto the earthly ground of an Egyptian settlement, was enacting in physical terms the fundamental concept of Egyptian kingship, the idea that the divine order of the universe, what the Egyptians called Ma'at, righteousness and cosmic balance, was made manifest in the person and presence of the pharaoh. Recent archaeological work has added remarkable new detail to our understanding of these royal vessels. Analysis of wood fragments, paintings, and inscriptions from various sites has revealed that the largest royal ships were extraordinary achievements of ancient engineering. They were built from cedar logs imported from Lebanon, wood so valuable and so difficult to obtain that it was essentially a luxury material, available only to the very wealthiest and most powerful individuals in the ancient world. The cedar forests of Lebanon were ancient Egypt's equivalent of an exotic foreign resource, something that had to be sought at great distance and considerable expense, and the fact that Egyptian pharaohs used this wood for their river vessels says everything about the scale of their ambition and the reach of their power. These ships were not small. The largest royal vessels could reach lengths of more than 40 meters, which is comparable to a small modern ship, and they were elaborately decorated both inside and out. The cabins on the royal deck, where the pharaoh and members of the royal family would have spent their time during journeys, were fitted with the finest furniture that Egyptian craftsmen could produce, chairs and couches of gilded wood inlaid with ebony and ivory, linen hangings dyed in rich colors, alabaster vessels for food and drink, and all the other equipment of royal luxury. Outside, the hull and superstructure of the ship would have been painted with religious imagery and scenes celebrating the pharaoh's divine status, turning the vessel itself into a kind of floating temple, a statement in wood and paint and gold that the gods were present and that Egypt was favored above all other lands. But the royal ships were not merely symbols. they were also tools, and among the most important things they transported was the pharaoh's ability to govern. In a civilization strung out along the length of a single great river, physical presence was enormously important. A pharaoh who could travel quickly and comfortably along the Nile could visit temples, oversee building projects, receive tribute from local governors, adjudicate disputes, and perform the religious ceremonies that were considered essential for maintaining cosmic order. The river, in other words, was the spine of Egyptian civilization, and the royal fleet was how power traveled along that spine. It was in this context of the Nile as a highway of power and commerce that one of the most extraordinary recent archaeological discoveries must be understood. Not far from the site of ancient Memphis, the great capital that stood near the apex of the Nile's delta and served for much of Egyptian history as the political and administrative heart of the country, archaeologists have excavated what they are describing as a valley temple unlike anything previously known. The structure dates to approximately 4,500 years ago, placing it in the Old Kingdom period, the era of pyramid building, of pharaohs like Khufu and Khafre and Menkaure, the age when Egypt's civilization was finding its full stride, and its builders were undertaking projects of such ambition that they still astonish us today. The Valley Temple concept was not itself new to archaeologists. Valley temples were known structures, typically built at the lower, riverside end of a causeway that led up to a pyramid complex. They served as the entry point into the sacred precinct of the royal mortuary cult, the place where the pharaoh's body would have arrived by boat from the royal palace to begin its journey toward its final resting place in the pyramid. The Valley Temple associated with the Pyramid of Khafre at Giza is one of the best-known examples, a magnificent structure of polished red granite that has survived remarkably well and gives us a sense of the grandeur these buildings once possessed. But this newly excavated Valley Temple is different in ways that are genuinely exciting to archaeologists and historians. For one thing, it is much larger than previously known examples, suggesting a scale of ritual activity and official function that was more elaborate than had been assumed for this period. For another, it shows clear evidence of having served not just as a religious building, but as a genuine hub of commercial and administrative activity, a place where the sacred and the secular, the divine and the practical, were thoroughly intermixed in a way that tells us something very important about how ancient Egyptian society actually functioned. The excavation team working at this site has uncovered a remarkable array of artifacts and architectural features. There are storerooms that would have held provisions and luxury goods, spaces that speak not just of religious ceremony, but of serious logistical organization. There are administrative areas with evidence of record-keeping, the Egyptian bureaucracy at work even at the doorstep of a sacred precinct. And then there is something that has particularly captured the imagination of researchers, evidence of what appears to be an ancient public calendar, carved or inscribed in a place where it could be read by people approaching the temple from the riverside. The significance of this calendar cannot be overstated. In a civilization as dependent on time and its proper measurement as ancient Egypt, the ability to track and announce the passage of days, months, and the all-important annual cycle of the Nile's flooding was a form of power. The Egyptian calendar was one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world. It divided the year into 3 seasons reflecting the Nile's behavior: the flood season, the growing season, and the harvest season, and further divided each season into months, and those months into weeks and days. At the same time, Egyptian priests tracked a separate lunar calendar used for religious festivals, and they were aware of a stellar calendar based on the rising and setting of particularly important stars, most notably Sirius, whose annual reappearance on the eastern horizon at dawn was seen as the harbinger of the Nile flood and was used to anchor the Egyptian year. A public calendar carved on or near a valley temple would have served multiple purposes simultaneously. It would have announced upcoming religious festivals and ceremonies, telling the surrounding population when important events would take place. It would have communicated the rhythm of the agricultural year, telling farmers when they should expect the flood to arrive, when they should begin planting, when harvest time was approaching. And it would have reinforced the central ideology of Egyptian kingship, because in Egyptian thinking, it was the pharaoh who maintained Ma'at, cosmic order, and the regular, predictable cycle of the seasons was a manifestation of that order. By displaying the calendar prominently on a royal temple, the king was essentially reminding everyone who saw it that this orderly progression of time was happening because the pharaoh was doing his divine job properly. The discovery of this valley temple is also exciting for what it reveals about the relationship between the great royal building projects of the Old Kingdom and the wider world of trade and commerce that made them possible. We sometimes think of the pyramids and the temples as existing in a kind of pure realm of divine kingship, separate from the messy economic realities of the ancient world, but of course they were not. Building a pyramid required enormous quantities of raw materials, stone and copper and wood and rope and 100 other things, and those materials had to be sourced, transported, and managed through systems of procurement and distribution that were, in their way, as impressive as the construction they supported. A valley temple that served as a commercial hub as well as a religious one gives us a glimpse into these systems, showing us that the sacred and the economic were not separate domains in ancient Egypt but thoroughly interwoven aspects of a single, remarkably complex civilization. The goods that flowed through a hub like this valley temple would have included both domestic products, grain, beer, linen, pottery, cattle, fish, and imported luxury items that were essential to the royal court and the temple system. Cedar from Lebanon has already been mentioned, but the list of Egyptian imports was remarkably long and came from remarkably distant places. From Nubia to the south came gold, which Egypt possessed in quantities that made it the envy of the ancient world, as well as ebony, leopard skins, and cattle. From Punt, a land that archaeologists still debate the exact location of, but which seems to have been somewhere in the region of modern Eritrea or Somalia, came myrrh and frankincense, the aromatic resins without which Egyptian religious ritual would have been impossible, as well as living trees, electrum, which is a natural alloy of gold and silver and other exotic goods. From the eastern Mediterranean came copper and tin, the raw materials for bronze, which was the essential metal of the age. From the north came olive oil and wine in great ceramic jars. All of this trade moved primarily by water. The Nile carried goods up and down the length of Egypt. Coastal and offshore trade routes connected Egypt to Lebanon, Cyprus, and the wider Mediterranean world. And the Red Sea, reached by crossing the eastern desert or the Sinai Peninsula, provided access to the trade routes that led to Punt and beyond. Egypt was not an isolated civilization, cut off from the rest of the world by its deserts. It was a trading civilization, deeply embedded in ancient networks of exchange that spanned thousands of miles and connected cultures that might seem, on the surface, to have had very little in common. From the banks of the Nile and the revelations of the newly excavated Valley Temple, we move now to what is perhaps the single most iconic archaeological site in the world, a complex of structures so familiar that their silhouettes have become symbols not just of Egypt but of human achievement itself. The Giza Plateau, rising above the west bank of the Nile just south of the modern city of Cairo, is home to three great pyramids, a collection of smaller subsidiary pyramids and mastaba tombs, the Great Sphinx, and several valley temples and causeways. It has been a destination for the curious and the reverent for more than 4,000 years. Ancient Egyptian pilgrims came here. Greek tourists came here. Roman emperors came here. And for the past 2 centuries, archaeologists from across the world have been coming here, digging and scanning and analyzing and arguing about what it all means and how it all came to be. And yet, despite all of that attention, despite thousands of years of visitors and 2 centuries of systematic archaeological work, the Giza Plateau is still, astonishingly, giving up new secrets. Recent advances in scanning technology have revealed something that has sent a charge of excitement through the archaeological world and rekindled debates about what exactly lies beneath the surface of this ancient and endlessly mysterious place. The Great Pyramid of Giza, known to the ancient Egyptians as Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu, is the oldest and largest of the 3 main pyramids on the plateau. It was built for the pharaoh Khufu, who reigned during the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, roughly around 2560 BCE, give or take a few decades. When it was completed, it was the tallest man-made structure on Earth, and it would hold that record for more than 3,800 years, until the construction of medieval cathedrals in Europe finally surpassed it. Even today, after millennia of erosion and stone robbing that have removed the original smooth white limestone casing and reduced its height slightly from the original 146 meters to the current 138 meters, it is an overwhelming physical presence. Standing at its base and looking up at the mountain of stone above you, the sheer scale of human ambition it represents is difficult to process. The Great Pyramid consists of approximately 2.3 million blocks of stone, ranging in weight from a couple of tons to more than 80 tons for the heaviest blocks in the burial chamber. The total mass of stone is estimated at more than 6 million tons. The precision with which it was constructed